The engines started before midnight, and once they started, there was no turning them off. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, over 6,000 paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division boarded C-47 transport aircraft across southern England. Each man carried between 60 and 100 pounds of equipment: rifles, ammunition bandoliers, grenades, rations, radios, demolition charges. Some carried sections of machine guns or mortar tubes weighing over 20 pounds apiece. The aircraft, each burning hundreds of gallons of fuel for the crossing, formed long serials that stretched for miles across the night sky. Their objective was not a single town, but a network of causeways, bridges, and road junctions behind Utah Beach. German defenses along the coast relied on movement through narrow exits bordered by flooded fields. If those exits remained in German hands, landing forces would stall under fire. If airborne units secured them, beachhead forces could expand inland. The calculation was exact. Hold specific bridges measured in yards, and intersections measured in meters, or the entire amphibious assault risked fracture. Anti-aircraft fire rose as aircraft crossed the French coast. Tracer rounds streaked upward in arcs. Pilots maneuvered abruptly to avoid flak bursts. Formations broke apart. Some aircraft released paratroopers miles from intended drop zones. Others dropped them too early or too late. By dawn, hundreds of small groups found themselves scattered across hedgerows and marshland. Inside one aircraft, as the green light illuminated, a paratrooper felt the vibration of the fuselage through his boots. The slipstream tore at his uniform as he stepped into darkness. Seconds later, parachute silk snapped open above him. He descended not into an orderly assembly area, but into fields crisscrossed by hedgerows and irrigation ditches. Equipment bundles landed separately, some lost in flooded terrain. German units in the region included infantry regiments and artillery batteries, equipped with guns firing shells weighing over 15 pounds. Machine gun nests guarded road junctions. Coastal batteries mounted heavier pieces, firing shells weighing dozens of pounds toward approaching naval forces. Yet, the sudden appearance of scattered American paratroopers fractured German command clarity. Reports flooded headquarters, describing landings at multiple points, some accurate, some misinterpreted. When I once examined drop zone maps against post-operation casualty reports and unit assembly logs, I noticed how dispersion, though initially disorienting, complicated German response. Instead of confronting a single concentrated formation, German commanders faced numerous small engagements across a wide area. The American plan had assumed tighter assembly. Reality produced improvisation. Paratroopers regrouped in ad hoc formations, sometimes led by officers commanding men from different companies or battalions. Small arms fire cracked through hedgerows. Explosives demolished bridges where capture proved impossible. Mortar teams fired shells weighing around 10 pounds at suspected enemy positions. Casualty rates varied by sector, but in some companies, losses during the first 24 hours exceeded 20%. By daylight, elements of the division secured key causeways leading inland from Utah Beach. German counterattacks collided with determined resistance. Tanks weighing over 20 tons attempted to advance along narrow roads bordered by hedges that restricted maneuver. American anti-tank teams positioned bazookas at close range. Each engagement unfolded in fields measured not in miles, but in yards. The night drop did not proceed according to rehearsed diagrams. Aircraft scattered. Radios malfunctioned. Units assembled under pressure. Yet the core objectives were achieved sufficiently to prevent German forces from sealing the beachhead. By the end of June 6th, despite dispersion and losses, the division had contributed to stabilizing the western flank of the invasion. The airborne assault represented a logistical feat as well. Hundreds of aircraft coordinated timing within minutes. Gliders carrying artillery pieces weighing several thousand pounds landed under fire. Supplies followed in additional waves. The effort required fuel measured in tens of thousands of gallons and ammunition measured in tons. For the men on the ground, the experience was less about strategy and more about sound and weight. The snap of parachute lines, the thud of landing, the metallic taste of fear in darkness, the smell of damp earth and gunpowder at dawn. If you were listening now, perhaps with the room quiet and lights low, imagine that night sky over Normandy. Aircraft engines fading as parachutes drift downward one by one. Imagine boots hitting soft ground, silence for a heartbeat, then distant gunfire. The darkness does not feel endless. It feels close and immediate. Let that image settle gently. This is the entire history of the 101st Airborne's night drop into Normandy. Chapter 1. The Division That Almost Wasn't. The 5th of February 1944. Somewhere on a road in England, damp, gray, the kind of afternoon that smells of diesel and wet wool. Major General William Carey Lee was on his way to watch paratroopers jump. He never arrived. A massive heart attack struck him before he reached the exercise field, and in the space of a single afternoon, the man who had built the 101st Airborne Division from nothing, who had argued and lobbied and practically willed it into existence, was gone from it forever. Not killed in action, not relieved, just struck down by his own body. 4 months before the battle, he had spent 2 years preparing for. They evacuated him to the United States. He never came back. He never wore that screaming eagle patch into combat. And the division he left behind, fully trained, superbly equipped, ideologically primed, now had to absorb that absence and keep moving toward an invasion date that wasn't going to adjust itself for anyone's grief. What strikes me, even now, looking at the personnel records and the command transition timeline, is how compressed it all was. Lee's first heart attack was on the 5th of February. A second followed in March. By the time Brigadier General Maxwell Davenport Taylor formally assumed command, the clock was already ticking with an urgency that left no room for the kind of quiet institutional handover that such a transfer demanded. Taylor came from the 82nd Airborne Division's artillery, not its infantry, not its airborne rifle culture. He was competent, physically brave, and by every account a man of considerable intelligence. But he wasn't Lee. He was inheriting a division that had been shaped, at the molecular level of its culture and its confidence, by someone else. That matters. It matters more than most histories of the Normandy operation are willing to admit. William C. Lee had been called the father of the American Airborne. That wasn't flattery. It was an operational description. He had spent years in the 1930s and early 40s fighting the institutional resistance of an army that didn't want paratroopers, didn't understand paratroopers, and in several documented cases, actively ridiculed the concept. He had written the doctrine. He had organized the training. He had, almost literally, designed the Screaming Eagle patch himself. When he addressed the 101st on its activation in August of 1942, he told the men in plain language that the division had a rendezvous with destiny. That phrase entered the historical record. Lee entered it too, but as a footnote rather than as a chapter, which is one of the quiet injustices of the way we tell this story. The 101st went to Normandy as Taylor's division. It went to Normandy as Lee's creation. Taylor inherited a force of somewhere around 13,000 men, organized into 3 parachute infantry regiments, the 501st, the 502nd, and the 506th, along with the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and supporting arms. The division's training had been rigorous and extended, much of it conducted at Camp Toccoa in Georgia, where the physical standards were genuinely brutal. But training is one thing, and command cohesion is another. Taylor's handover coincided with a period of critical final exercises, and the pace of those exercises reveals something worth pausing over. The divisional night jump rehearsal, Exercise Eagle, was originally scheduled for the 7th of May, was postponed to the 11th and 12th, and by the official assessment was judged uniformly successful by the 53rd Troop Carrier Wing. The key phrase in that assessment, buried in the documentation, is that the positive rating was made without factoring that most successful missions had been flown in clear weather. That caveat existed, it was noted, and then, institutionally, it was set aside. The 9th Troop Carrier Command itself was a patchwork that would not survive a close reading uncritiqued. By the end of May 1944, Brigadier General Paul Williams had assembled 1,207 Douglas C-47 Skytrains across 14 groups of wildly uneven quality. 4 of those groups had seen significant combat in the 12th Air Force. 4 had trained together for over a year in the United States. The remaining 6 ranged from barely formed to completely green, and among them were 2 groups, the 315th and the 442nd, that the command's own inspectors had designated the weak sisters of the operation. Those 2 groups hadn't dropped actual paratroopers until May. They qualified on simulated drops, conducted in conditions the inspectors specifically noted were favorable, meaning clear skies and no enemy fire. They were rated fully qualified. They would fly on the night of the 5th of June. The physical aircraft themselves carried a risk that the official record acknowledges, but the popular history has largely forgotten. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, personally refused 9th Troop Carrier Command's request for self-sealing fuel tanks on the C-47s, citing limited supply. This is documented. The aircraft that would carry nearly 7,000 men across the English Channel and into the most important airborne drop in history would do so with standard, unprotected fuel tanks, in a flat corridor, at night. There's a certain quality to that decision that I find almost impossible to categorize cleanly. It wasn't recklessness, it was a genuine material constraint. But reading it in the dry language of the requisition denial, knowing what those aircraft were about to fly into, produces a feeling that no amount of historical distance fully neutralizes. There's a training incident from the exercise Eagle rehearsal that I keep returning to. The 216th Troop Carrier Group's 2 lead aircraft collided in mid-air during the exercise. Both crews perished, 14 men killed in total, including the group commander, Colonel Burton Fleet. The collision occurred not over France, not under enemy fire, but over England, in a training exercise. It was logged, grieved, and the group continued training. The replacements were brought in, the timetable was maintained. When you cross-reference this with the 9 Troop Carrier Command's own readiness assessment, which notes that 20% of D-Day crews had minimum night training, and that fully 3/4 of all crews had never been under fire, the picture that emerges is not one of a polished veteran force. It is one of a force that was, in large and documented portions, flying beyond the boundary of its tested competence, on a mission that left no room for the kind of scatter that its own exercises had already demonstrated was possible in poor visibility. I want to be direct about something. The popular historical narrative of the 101st Airborne in Normandy tends to begin with courage and end with success, and it isn't wrong to do either of those things. The division did show extraordinary courage. The objectives were substantially achieved, but that framing consistently compresses the institutional reality of what the men were jumping out of. A command structure that was 10 weeks old at the top, flying an aircraft that hadn't been tested in the conditions they were about to enter, organized around a navigation system that went operationally blind at the moment of greatest need. The failure that followed wasn't random. It was almost cartographically predictable from the data that existed before a single engine started. The 101st Airborne Division deserves better than the history that only tells the triumphant half of its story. By the end of May 1944, more than 6,000 men of the 101st had completed their jump qualifications, packed their T-5 parachutes, and been assigned a specific aircraft by chalk number, a sequential number literally chalked onto each fuselage near the jump door to prevent boarding errors in the chaos of dark airfield operations. Each man wore a duplicate of that chalk number around his neck. The bureaucracy was complete. The aircraft were ready. The navigational plan was in place, with its known failure modes noted and set aside. Maxwell Taylor was in command of a division built by someone else, flying toward a battle that would define both of them. An aircraft without self-sealing fuel tanks, toward drop zones already being compromised by the Pathfinder teams that were supposed to make the whole thing work. The rendezvous with destiny that William Lee had promised his men 3 years earlier was 12 days away. What remained was the weather and the night. Chapter 2: The Enemy's Gift, Rommel's Flooded Fields. The Norman countryside in the spring of 1944 was, from a distance, beautiful. The bocage, those dense ancient hedgerows of tangled earth and root that divided the Cotentin Peninsula into 1,000 interlocking rooms, was green in the way that only a landscape fed by Atlantic rain can be green. The rivers moved slowly, the fields were flat, and in the low-lying ground between the Douve River and the coast behind Utah Beach, where the land barely reached above sea level, whole meadows were full of standing water. Not rainwater, not floodwater in the seasonal sense. This was deliberate. It had been engineered, and the engineer was Erwin Rommel, who had inspected this coastline in the late autumn of 1943 and seen, in those low fields, not a liability but a weapon. The German defensive concept on the Cotentin was built around a simple observation. Fixed fortifications could not stop airborne troops from landing. They could slow an amphibious force at the waterline, but paratroopers fell from the sky onto whatever ground they chose. Rommel understood this with unusual clarity. His response was to modify the ground itself. Along the Douve River Valley and the coastal flats northeast of Cotentin, German engineers began working with the existing Norman sluice infrastructure, the locks and water gates that Norman farmers had used for centuries to manage irrigation and drainage, and reversed their purpose. Instead of keeping water out of the low fields, the sluices were opened to let it in. The flooding was deliberate, systematic, and in places documented in German Army Group B engineering surveys as explicitly intended to deny usable landing areas to Allied airborne forces. It covered an estimated 25 square kilometers of what had previously been dry farmland. On aerial photographs taken in the months before D-Day, those fields looked like marshes. On the actual ground, in the dark of a June night, they looked like grass. Now, here is where the archive becomes interesting and slightly uncomfortable for anyone who wants to tell a clean story about Allied intelligence. The American planning documents for Operation Albany, the code name for the 101st's drop, do acknowledge the presence of flooded areas in the Douve Valley. They describe them as a hazard. What they do not do, at any point I've been able to find, is classify the open fields as a drowning risk for fully equipped paratroopers. There's a distinction being drawn there, implicitly, that seems to assume a man can simply stand up in a flooded field and walk clear of his harness. The average equipment load for a 101st paratrooper on D-Day night was somewhere between 70 and 125 pounds, depending on the source you use, and the sources do differ, which means that a man who hit standing water in full combat load was not landing in a flooded field. He was landing in a trap. Several after-action accounts and medical reports from the 326th Medical Company describe men who drowned in water they could have stood up in on a dry day. They didn't stand up because the weight wouldn't let them, and because the T5 harness they were wearing required a deliberate two-handed rotational action at the chest release box to come free. In the cold and the dark and the panic of sinking backwards under 100 pounds of equipment, that two-handed action was frequently the thing that killed them. The T5 parachute harness was not a badly designed piece of equipment. I want to be precise about that. The quick release box on the chest, a circular metal housing that required a half-turn twist and a firm press to open, was specifically engineered to prevent accidental releases during the violent opening shock of deployment, and to allow rapid harness removal on landing when a billowing canopy might otherwise drag a man across the ground. It solved those problems well. What the designers hadn't modeled, what the doctrine hadn't addressed, was the scenario of a loaded paratrooper entering water face down, with the center of gravity of his equipment pulling him backward, and the harness holding the entire load against his chest. The release mechanism that worked in a second on dry ground became a fine motor challenge that cold water, orientation loss, and the simple physics of submersion could defeat entirely. The Army knew that flooding existed in the drop zones. The harness was not modified before the operation. The equipment loads were not reduced. Those are facts, not accusations. They are facts that appear in the record and don't appear in the popular narrative, which is one of the reasons I find the popular narrative insufficient. Rommel's anti-airborne preparation wasn't limited to water. In the open pastures and flat meadows of the Cotentin, the fields that on an aerial photograph looked like ideal landing areas, his engineers had been driving wooden poles into the earth since late 1943. The Germans called them Holzpfahle, literally wooden stakes. The Allies called them Rommel's asparagus. They were logs, typically 4 to 5 meters high, driven at 45-degree angles into the ground across open fields that might otherwise serve as glider landing zones or parachute drop areas. In their basic form, they were obstacles. In their more lethal configuration, documented in several Allied intelligence assessments, they were tipped with artillery shells or mines, designed to explode on contact with an incoming glider wing. The asparagus poles were visible in aerial reconnaissance photographs. American planners knew they existed in the Cotentin. The landing zones chosen for the 101st were selected in part because they appeared to have fewer of the poles than adjacent fields. They had fewer. They were not clear. What I find genuinely striking, when I put the flooding map and the asparagus distribution map side by side with the 101st's planned drop zones, is the specificity of the German defensive thinking. This wasn't a broad, generic defensive preparation. The inundated zone was concentrated precisely in the area between the Utah Beach Causeways and the Douve River, the exact corridor that the 101st would need to secure and control to allow the 4th Infantry Division to move off the beach. The flooding wasn't placed at random. It was placed where American planners needed clear ground. Rommel or his staff had read the terrain with professional accuracy and modified it accordingly. The question of whether that reading was based on captured intelligence, logical inference, or simple professional instinct about where an assault force would need to move is not something the surviving German records resolve cleanly. There's a detail about the La Barquette lock that I don't think any documentary I've encountered has stated plainly enough, and it stays with me as one of the more operationally ironic details of the entire Normandy airborne operation. La Barquette was a water control lock on the Douve River near Cotentin, one of the lock structures that German engineers had used to maintain the flooding of the surrounding marshes. It was also one of the 101st Airborne's most critical D-Day objectives, assigned to the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, to capture by early morning on the 6th of June. This means that the object the 501st was being asked to seize and hold, under fire, in the dark, after landing in scattered small groups across a flooded landscape, was the precise mechanism that was simultaneously drowning some of its own men as they hit the ground. The lock that killed them was the lock they were being sent to capture. Nobody planned that irony. The geography just produced it. Rommel-Spargel poles, where they survived the war intact, were 4 to 5 meters of raw timber, driven to a depth of roughly 1 meter in the Norman earth, angled toward an approaching aircraft at a geometry that maximized the chance of striking a wing root or fuselage. Allied aerial photographs from April and May of 1944 show them in rows across open fields, visible, documented, and counted. What the photographs couldn't show was the mine attachment points at the tops of many poles, because those were added close to D-Day, after the last usable reconnaissance flights. The intelligence that went into the 101st's pre-mission briefing about asparagus poles was accurate as of April. It was incomplete as of June. That's not a planning failure in the conventional sense. It's the fog of war. But it meant that glider pilots aiming for fields selected partly on the basis of pole density were, in some cases, flying toward updated obstacles that their maps didn't show. By the end of May 1944, the landscape the 101st was going to fall into had been transformed from its peacetime self into something considerably more hostile than the aerial photographs fully revealed. The water table in the Douve Valley had been raised by German engineering to create a partially submerged killing field in the exact area the division needed to operate. The open pastures were dotted with timber stakes designed to destroy incoming aircraft. The causeways were defended. And all of this terrain modification had been accomplished not by armies in the field, but by engineers with maps and sluice gates and axes. Rommel had, in a sense, turned the Norman countryside itself into a defensive weapon. The 101st was going to fall out of the sky into a landscape that wanted them dead before a single German soldier pulled a trigger. The water was already in the fields, the poles were already in the ground, and somewhere over England, more than 400 C-47s were being loaded with men who had no idea how wet the Norman night was going to be. Chapter 3. 432 planes, one night, no margin. 10:30 on the evening of the 5th of June, 1944. At airfields across the southern counties of England, the engines of Douglas C-47 Skytrains were turning over one by one, filling the pre-invasion darkness with a low, mechanical thunder that ground crews had been living with for weeks, but which sounded different tonight. Tonight, it was real. 432 aircraft were being prepared for Mission Albany, the code name for the 101st Airborne Division's parachute insertion into the Cotentin Peninsula. 6,928 men were going to board those aircraft in the next few hours. Each aircraft had been assigned a specific sequential chalk number. Each stick of 15 to 18 paratroopers knew their aircraft, their seat, their order in the stick, their position in the exit line. The planning was meticulous. The paperwork was complete. The thing that wasn't complete, the thing that appears in the readiness documents and then disappears from the popular narrative, was the crew's training. The 9th Troop Carrier Command that Brigadier General Paul Williams commanded in June of 1944 was, on paper, a formidable force. 1,207 C-47s, most of them less than a year old, all in excellent mechanical condition after a sustained maintenance effort that had replaced every engine identified as problematic during spring training. The aircraft were ready. 3/4 of the aircraft were ready, by any reasonable measure. But 40% of the crews assigned to the D-Day parachute mission had arrived as recent replacements or individual fill-ins who had not been present for the majority of the night formation training that Williams's command had conducted since March. 20% of all crews had what the readiness assessment described, in plain language, as minimum night training, and fully 3/4 of every man flying that night had never once been under fire. Williams knew this. It is in his command records. He wrote one word next to the relevant table entry in the readiness document: except. One syllable. The entire moral weight of a risk calculation made at the highest level of his command, compressed into 6 letters, and then filed. The C-47 Skytrain in its troop carrier configuration for the Normandy operation was not quite the same aircraft as the civilian DC-3 from which it had been adapted. It had been fitted with a reinforced cabin floor, a large starboard side cargo door that could be removed entirely for parachute operations, and a static line cable running the length of the fuselage interior. Each aircraft was configured to carry a stick of roughly 15 to 18 fully equipped paratroopers, men who, depending on the individual and the mission assignment, were carrying between 70 and 125 pounds of combined equipment weight. Beneath the fuselage, many of the 101st's C-47s were carrying external parapacks, cylindrical external carriage containers on quick-release frames, holding heavy equipment, demolition materials, medical supplies, and additional ammunition that couldn't be carried on the body. The parapacks added aerodynamic drag to the already heavily loaded aircraft. They also shifted the center of gravity rearward, toward the tail, which made the aircraft slightly nose-light and complicated the precise, tight formation flying that the entire mission depended on. This detail appears in the 9th Troop Carrier Command's post-mission analysis. It had been known before the mission. It was accepted, like so many things, and set aside. The navigation architecture that was supposed to prevent 6,000 men from landing in the wrong fields was a layered system with an elegant concept and a critical flaw in its geometry. At its center was the Rebecca Eureka transponding radar, an airborne interrogator unit installed in the C-47 flight leads that would receive radio frequency pulses from ground-based Eureka beacons set up by the Pathfinder teams and display bearing and approximate range on a cathode ray scope in the aircraft's cockpit. The system had been used with good results in Italy in September of 1943, during the Salerno landings, and its track record justified at least cautious confidence. What the Salerno experience hadn't fully revealed was the system's geometric weakness at close range. Within roughly 2 miles of the ground emitter, the signal geometry caused the range and bearing indicators to merge into a single, indistinct blip on the scope. In plain terms, the Rebecca went blind at the moment pilots needed it most, in the final approach to the drop zone, when the decision to open the jump door and give the green light was seconds away. The system was designed to deliver formations to within a few miles of a drop zone. Getting the rest of the way right depended on the Hall of Fame marking lights, amber directional beacons set out by the Pathfinder teams on the ground. If those lights weren't there, the approach window closed on the pilots with nothing to guide them through it. Beyond the navigation system's inherent limitations, the entire operational architecture of Mission Albany rested on an assumption that deserves to be examined with some care: that 60% of C-47 aircraft could navigate accurately without a dedicated navigator aboard. Williams's command went to Normandy with navigators on only 40% of its aircraft, the remainder relying on pilots to manage both flight duties and navigation simultaneously, during formation flight, at night, under radio silence, into anticipated anti-aircraft fire. When formations broke up, as they had broken up in the April 4th training exercise in poor visibility, with no enemy fire at all, those pilot navigators became, functionally, solo operators with compasses and maps in darkness over unfamiliar terrain. The system held together as long as everything worked. The number of things that had to keep working simultaneously, without a single backup layer, was not small. For the final approach to the Cotentin Peninsula, the 9th Troop Carrier Command's routing had been carefully designed to minimize exposure to German anti-aircraft guns. The serials would fly south from England at low altitude, 500 feet above sea level, below German radar coverage, cross the English Channel toward the Channel Islands, pass between Guernsey and Alderney, make a final turn over the western Cotentin coast at an initial point near Port Bale, codenamed Muleshoe, and then fly east to their respective drop zones. The route had been selected specifically because the western Cotentin coast was considerably less defended than the eastern approaches. The plan was sound, in the way that plans built on the assumption of continued clear weather tend to be sound. The weather over the English Channel on the night of the 5th of June was clear. The formations assembled cleanly over their wing assembly points. The serials flew south with discipline and precision, hit the marker boat in the channel at almost exactly the right time, and turned for France in tight formation. For roughly 24 minutes over the water, everything was working. Then the serials crossed the coastline of the Cotentin Peninsula, and the cloud bank appeared. I want to pause here for a moment on the self-sealing fuel tank question, because it represents something about the institutional decision-making of the period that deserves more than a footnote. The 9th Troop Carrier Command had formally requested self-sealing fuel tanks for its C-47s, fuel tanks with a rubber lining that would seal around a bullet hole and prevent the catastrophic fuel fires that standard tanks were vulnerable to in a flak environment. The request was denied by General Arnold, the Chief of the Army Air Forces, on the grounds that the material was in limited supply and the operational priorities lay elsewhere. This was not an oversight or an administrative error. It was a deliberate decision made by a senior commander who weighed the competing demands on his supply chain and determined that the troop carriers flying the invasion's airborne mission could manage without the protection. The aircraft that flew 432 sorties into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe that night had unprotected fuel tanks. 21 of them were destroyed on D-Day alone. The detailed pre-mission readiness assessments, the training exercise records, the navigation system documentation, the aircraft loading manifests. When I read these documents together, what they collectively describe is a plan that was genuinely ambitious, professionally organized, and built with careful attention to a set of problems, while simultaneously accepting a separate set of risks as the price of going at all. The risks weren't secret, they weren't hidden. They were noted, annotated, and set aside in pencil by the men who had to make the final calls. That's the uncomfortable thing about the 101st Airborne's D-Day story. It wasn't planned carelessly. It was planned with full awareness of the gaps, and then executed anyway, because the strategic imperative was real, and because nobody above the level of the individual troop carrier crew had to be the one to actually fly into the cloud. At 10:30 on the evening of the 5th of June, the first C-47s began rolling down the runways of their southern English airfields. Chalk numbers 1 through 432, 15 to 18 men per aircraft, engines with no self-sealing tanks, 40% without navigators, 20% with minimum night training, 6,928 reasons that everything had to go right. Most things wouldn't. Chapter 4. The Pathfinders Go First, Alone. Shortly before midnight on the 5th of June, 1944, 3 C-47s, carrying the 1st Pathfinder team assigned to Drop Zone Alpha of the 101st Airborne, lifted off from an English airfield. They were small aircraft, 12 to 15 men in each, rather than the usual stick of paratroopers. The men inside weren't carrying rifles as their primary tool. They were carrying Eureka transponder beacons, holophane marking lamps, signal equipment, and the weight of a responsibility that no briefing document could fully describe. They were the first Americans, and quite possibly the first Allied soldiers, to land in France on the night of the invasion. Every aircraft that followed them, every one of those 432 C-47s, loaded with the 101st's 6,928 men, was depending on what these teams accomplished in the next 40 minutes. 300 men total across all Pathfinder teams for both the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, 14 to 18 per drop zone. If they got it right, the men behind them had a chance of landing where the plan said they would. If they didn't get it right, there was nothing else. The Pathfinder system had been developed specifically because of the Sicily disaster, the catastrophic friendly fire incident in July of 1943, in which Allied naval vessels, underbriefed and jumpy after an earlier German air attack, had shot down 23 American C-47s, carrying men of the 82nd Airborne over the Mediterranean. More than 300 paratroopers were killed or drowned in that incident, not by German fire, but by American guns that didn't know what they were shooting at. The Pathfinder concept was born from that failure, A small advance team dropped first, equipped with navigation beacons, to mark the drop zones before the main serials arrived. In principle, it solved the Sicily problem. In practice, it replaced one vulnerability with another. Instead of depending on good weather and accurate navigation for hundreds of aircraft simultaneously, the plan now depended on 14 men with fragile equipment landing accurately in hostile territory, setting up their beacons without being killed in the first 20 minutes, and guiding thousands of follow-on troops from a position of complete isolation with no communication back to the main force. The Pathfinder teams for the 101st were organized around the Rebecca Eureka system and the holophane marking lights. The Eureka, a ground-based transponder beacon weighing roughly 15 pounds, would emit a signal detectable by the Rebecca interrogator units installed in the lead C-47s of the main serials. The holophane lamps were directional amber lights, designed to be visible from approaching aircraft at altitude, while remaining difficult to detect from the ground at distances beyond about 300 meters. This directionality was a genuine engineering success for its specific purpose. It was also an engineering constraint with a sharp operational edge. A holophane lamp pointed toward an inbound aircraft on the correct approach bearing was visible. A holophane lamp pointed at an aircraft that was already off course, approaching from the wrong direction because its formation had broken up and it was navigating independently. That lamp was simply invisible. The directional feature that made the light safe from German observation also made it useless to the pilots who needed it most. Drop Zone Alpha's Pathfinder serial arrived over the Cotentin in the right general area, but missed the designated zone and set up approximately a mile away from the planned position, near the village of Saint-Germain-de-Varaville. This wasn't a devastating error in itself. A mile off in a flat landscape can still allow useful guidance if the equipment works. The equipment didn't work. Both the Eureka beacon and the holophane lights failed to function until the drop was already well in progress. The first assault serials of the 500 and 2nd Parachute Infantry Regiment were inbound before the navigation equipment at Alpha was operational. The Pathfinders were there, the beacons were there, the lights were there. They just weren't working yet, at the precise moment when they needed to be working. That is the operational story of Drop Zone Alpha in 12 words. And no amount of dramatic elaboration changes what it means. Drop Zone Charlie's Pathfinder story was different, and in some ways worse. One of the 3 aircraft in the DZ Charlie serial ditched in the sea on the way in. Not from enemy fire, but from circumstances the records don't fully clarify. The 2 surviving aircraft dropped their teams reasonably close to the designated zone. But the holophane marking lights were in the ditched aircraft. They were at the bottom of the English Channel. The team managed to activate a Eureka beacon just before the first assault serials arrived, and they had a single handheld signal light, not a directional holophane, just a handheld lamp, which some pilots could see and some could not, depending on their angle of approach. The official record notes that the guidance at DZ Charlie was partially effective. The men who guided thousands of paratroopers to their drop zone with a handheld lamp in a dark Normandy field, surrounded by Germans, with 1 aircraft's worth of their equipment on the seafloor, deserve better than the phrase partially effective. But that is what the record says. Drop Zone Delta was the worst case, and it matters more than the others because Delta was the assigned zone for the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, the unit with the most operationally critical objective of the night, the La Barquette lock on the Douve River. Delta's Pathfinder serial missed its final turning point entirely, flew past the zone, turned back from an unfamiliar direction, and dropped its teams 10 minutes late and roughly a mile from the correct position. The late drop was directly connected to a planning timeline, compressed by circumstances. Drop Zone Delta had only been finalized on the 27th of May, 9 days before D-Day, when the 501st's mission was reshuffled in response to German troop movements in the Cotentin. The pilots assigned to mark Delta had 9 days of specific preparation for a mission that their counterparts at Alpha and Charlie had had months to plan. Nobody flagged this in writing as a risk requiring additional mitigation. The timeline moved on, and the Pathfinders did what they could, which was to activate their Eureka beacon with German troops so close that deploying visual lights would have meant immediate death. They turned the beacon on in a ditch and waited. What I find most difficult to reconcile, reading the Pathfinder accounts in sequence with the main force drop records, is the distance between effort and outcome. The Pathfinder teams, by every account available, including the ones in the Cornelius Ryan archive at Ohio University, did extraordinary things. They jumped first, alone, into darkness, onto or near targets held by an awake and alert German army, and they performed their technical functions under conditions that would have justified failure. Drop Zone Charlie's team got a Eureka beacon working with a single handheld backup light after losing half their equipment in the sea. Drop Zone Delta's team activated their beacon with German voices 40 yards away. They did this. It worked, imperfectly, partially, and thousands of men still landed miles from where the plan said they would. That gap between individual performance and systemic outcome is the central human tragedy of the whole navigation story. 300 Pathfinders, 6 drop zones, each team 14 to 18 men. The math of what was being asked of them is visible in its starkest form when you compare those numbers to the serial sizes they were guiding. A single Pathfinder team, successfully deployed, was expected to guide a serial of up to 54 C-47s, carrying nearly 900 men to a precise ground position in darkness from altitude. 1 Eureka beacon, several holophane lamps, and a German army that had been told, through some combination of intelligence and professional inference, to expect exactly this kind of advance team. The Germans in the drop zone areas were not asleep on the night of the 5th of June. They'd been receiving reports of increased Allied activity, increased maritime traffic, increased air activity. Some accounts suggest German units in the Cotentin had been placed on heightened alert in the days before the invasion. The Pathfinder teams didn't land in their designated zones to find empty fields. They landed in the dark, next to people who wanted to kill them, carrying equipment that had to work on the first attempt, with no backup system, no reinforcement, and no communication back to anyone who could help. One of the Pathfinder accounts in the Ryan collection describes the experience of setting up a Eureka beacon while lying flat in a ditch, with German voices audible on the far side of a hedgerow. The man wrote, "I turned the Eureka on and prayed somebody up there was reading it. He couldn't deploy his lights. He couldn't move without exposing himself. He could only lie still in the Normandy dark and trust that the signal going up from his beacon was reaching the Rebecca scopes in the aircraft that were, somewhere above the clouds, trying to find him. Some of them did, most of them didn't, and the 6,928 men of the 101st Airborne Division were already in the air, their chalk numbers chalked on their aircraft, their static lines clipped and ready, their equipment checks complete, flying toward whatever the Pathfinders had managed to leave for them in the fields below. The beacon was on. The lights were mostly dark. The cloud bank was ahead. Chapter 5. Into the Cloud. 0048 to 0140. 0048 hours. The 5th of June had become the 6th. The first sticks of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment began leaving their aircraft over the Cotentin Peninsula of Normandy. Not over the planned drop zone, not in the neat ground pattern the training maps had shown, but over whatever the clouds and the flak and the fear had left them with. The entire operation that the planning documents called Mission Albany was officially underway. It had taken less than 18 minutes from the first serial's arrival over the peninsula to begin producing a scatter pattern so wide that the 101st Airborne Division would spend the next 3 days trying to reconstitute itself as a fighting unit from the fragments the night had thrown across 50 miles of Norman countryside. Between 0048 and 0140 that morning, a window of 52 minutes, 6,928 men left their aircraft over a peninsula that had not looked, from the air, like the briefing maps had said it would look. The cloud bank was not in the weather forecast for the mission. That's a sentence that seems almost too simple to carry the weight it has to carry, but it's accurate. The meteorological conditions over the English Channel on the evening of the 5th had been acceptable. Not ideal, but acceptable. The serials had assembled cleanly, flown their channel crossing at 500 feet above sea level in good visibility, and approached the Cotentin coastline in tight formation. Then, as the aircraft turned inland from their initial point near Port Bale on the western coast, a solid overcast appeared at penetration altitude, a cloud deck that covered the entire western half of the peninsula, 12 miles across, opaque and unforecast, at exactly the altitude the formations were flying. 9 of the 20 serials that made up missions Albany and Boston combined flew directly into that cloud bank. All 9 were badly scattered. The 6 serials that achieved concentrated drops were the ones that didn't fly through cloud. The correlation is, statistically and operationally, absolute. Not ambiguous, absolute. The physics of what happens to a tight formation of C-47s when it enters a solid cloud bank at night can be described precisely without embellishment, because the reality is mechanical enough to speak for itself. The formation's principle of cohesion was visual. Pilots maintained their position by watching the blue formation lights of adjacent aircraft. In clear conditions, that system worked. In zero visibility cloud, those lights disappeared within seconds of cloud entry. There was no instrument-based formation protocol for the I-10 Troop Carrier Command at Normandy. When the visual reference vanished, the formation dissolved. Not gradually, not partially. It dissolved immediately and permanently. Each pilot became an individual navigator, operating in silence under the radio blackout that was mandatory for the mission, unable to warn other aircraft of weather or deviations, unable to query the Pathfinder beacons because only flight leads were authorized to use the Rebecca system to prevent signal saturation. The neat V of V's formation that had flown the Channel crossing, 9 aircraft arranged in a 3x3 pattern, flights stacked behind each other at 1,000-foot intervals, became, over the western Cotentin, a collection of individual aircraft making individual navigational decisions in darkness and cloud. Some pilots climbed above the cloud, some pushed through it, some descended below it. The decisions were made independently and without coordination, which is what happens when the coordination mechanism disappears. The pilots who pushed through the cloud emerged over the eastern half of the peninsula in time to find visual references and get their sticks out reasonably close to the planned zones. The ones who climbed or descended found themselves separated from their serials and disoriented over unfamiliar terrain. Several aircraft made second and third passes over the drop zone area, searching for visual references that weren't there. Some pilots, encountering German anti-aircraft fire, which began almost immediately as the aircraft crossed the coast, reacted by increasing airspeed. The prescribed drop speed for the T-5 parachute was 110 miles per hour. Some aircraft in the Albany serials were flying at 160 miles per hour when their men jumped. The T-5's deployment shock at 160 miles per hour was not what the parachute was designed to handle. The difference between a safe deployment and a dangerous one, fractures, soft tissue damage, in some documented cases parachute hardware failure, was those 50 miles per hour of excess speed, put there by pilots who were frightened and doing what frightened pilots do. The anti-aircraft fire over the Cotentin was real, heavy in places, and produced by German gunners who had been tracking the sound of aircraft engines for several minutes before they opened up. Most of the flak was unguided, aimed by sound and muzzle flash, not by radar, but that didn't make it ineffective. Tracer rounds rose from multiple directions simultaneously as the serials crossed the coast. Several aircraft were hit, others broke formation to evade. The documentary record of the fire is consistent enough to describe it as genuinely disruptive to formation integrity, even before the cloud bank compounded everything. 21 C-47s were lost on D-Day during the parachute assault missions, some to flak, some to circumstances the records don't entirely clarify. 21 aircraft out of 432 is a 5% loss rate on the delivery vehicles. The deeper damage was what the flak did to the pilots and formations that weren't destroyed. It pushed speeds up, broke formation spacing, and turned the already compromised navigation into something approaching chaos. When I was working through the post-mission analysis documents, specifically the 9th Troop Carrier Command's own assessment, which was thorough and relatively candid about what had gone wrong, I found a line that stopped me. The document notes, in discussing the scattered drops, that the same troop carrier groups that performed so poorly on the night parachute mission flew with precision and success under heavy fire in the daytime glider missions later on D-Day and on the days that followed. The same pilots, the same aircraft, the same German anti-aircraft guns. The difference was daylight. In daylight, over terrain they could see, under fire they could navigate around visually, those crews performed well. In darkness, in cloud, they scattered a division. That contrast is the most devastating single piece of evidence in the entire debate about whether the night drop was sound operational planning. The planes were fine. The pilots were adequate. The night was the problem. Of the 20 serials in missions Albany and Boston combined, the breakdown between concentrated and scattered drops follows the cloud almost perfectly. Of the 9 serials that flew through the cloud bank, all 9 produced badly scattered drops. Of the 6 serials that avoided the cloud and maintained formation integrity, 5 produced drops that the post-mission analysis rated as reasonably accurate. The remaining 5 serials had mixed outcomes driven by secondary factors: anti-aircraft evasion, delayed recognition of drop zone markers, pilot disorientation on the eastern side of the peninsula where the cloud thinned. This is not a statistical ambiguity requiring interpretation. It's a documented outcome sitting clearly in the official record. The cloud caused the scatter compromised the mission, and the cloud was unforecast, which means that the mission's most critical vulnerability was a weather feature that the planning assumed wouldn't be there. There's a detail about the day's airborne missions that appears in the USAF official history and deserves more prominence than it usually gets. On the afternoon of D-Day, and on the days immediately following, the same 9th Troop Carrier Command Groups flew glider resupply missions over the Cotentin in daylight, under the same German anti-aircraft fire that had terrorized the night parachute crews. The accuracy of those missions was significantly higher. Gliders arrived at their designated landing zones in numbers and concentrations that the pre-dawn parachute drops had not approached. The night drops advocates sometimes argue that daylight operations would have produced catastrophic aircraft losses. The afternoon glider missions suggest that the loss rate under daylight conditions, while real, was not the annihilation that Lee Mallory and others feared. Of 42 total C-47 losses in the Normandy operations over multiple days, 21 occurred on the night parachute mission. Not 42, not even 30, 21. The night was expensive. The alternative might have been cheaper than the plan assumed. The last stick of the 101st Airborne Division left its aircraft at 0140 on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944. 52 minutes after the first jump, the drop was complete. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, in fields and marshes and hedgerows and flooded ditches, 6,928 men were now on the ground, scattered across an area the size of a small county, most of them without any idea where they were. Most of them separated from every man they knew, all of them armed and trained and waiting for a cricket sound in the dark that might mean a friend, and might not. 4,832 tons of men and equipment had left the aircraft. The plan said they'd be in drop zones Alpha, Charlie, and Delta. Most of them weren't. The cloud had seen to that. Above them, the C-47s turned for England. Below them, the Norman night was waiting. Chapter 6, Chalk 23. Eisenhower's last conversation. The 5th of June, 1944. Late afternoon, fading toward evening. Somewhere at RAF Greenham Common in Berkshire, General of the Army Dwight David Eisenhower walked through a crowd of paratroopers from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. The photographs from that evening have become among the most reproduced images of the entire war. Eisenhower in his dress uniform, hands clasped or extended, speaking with small groups of men in full combat load, jumpsuits over equipment, faces darkened in some cases, with what would later be described as theatrical touches of camouflage paint. He didn't look like a man performing a ceremonial duty. He looked, in the photographs and in the accounts of people who were there, like a man saying goodbye to people he had decided to send into mortal danger, and who could not be told how certain that danger was. He knew what was in Lee Mallory's letter. He had read it 4 days earlier. He had overruled it, and now he was walking among the men the letter was about. The specific detail that grounds this whole scene in something more than historical atmosphere is the placard visible around the neck of First Lieutenant Wallace Strobel in the most famous of the Greenham Common photographs. Strobel was the jumpmaster for Chalk 23, 438th Troop Carrier Group. That placard, a laminated card worn on a cord around the neck, was the physical ticket that connected a specific man to a specific aircraft in the Albany serial order. The 438th Troop Carrier Group was assigned to carry men of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment to Drop Zone Alpha. Chalk 23 was one of those aircraft, and Strobel's battalion, the 2nd Battalion of the 502nd, was assigned to the first serial over the peninsula. When Eisenhower shook hands with Strobel and the men around him, he was shaking hands with the men who were going in first, the first Americans to jump into Normandy. The chalk number around Strobel's neck made that fact visible and specific in a way that no general description of D-Day can replicate. The letter that had brought Eisenhower to Greenham Common, or at least the letter that had made the visit an act of private moral reckoning rather than a public relations exercise, was Lee Mallory's formal protest, delivered in writing to the Supreme Allied Commander on the 31st of May, 1944. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commander of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, had put his objection to the American airborne operations in the starkest possible terms. He predicted 70% casualties among glider troops and 50% among paratroopers. He called it, in language that Eisenhower preserved in his diary, a potential futile slaughter of two fine divisions. Lee Mallory underlined those words, in his own hand, in the letter. Eisenhower read them, slept on them, and on the 1st of June wrote in his diary that overruling the protest had been a soul-racking decision. He used those words, soul-racking, not difficult, not challenging, soul-racking. And then he drove to Greenham Common and walked among the men he'd committed to the calculation. Eisenhower's public account of the Greenham Common visit, in his memoir Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, describes the paratroopers as cheerful and confident, and describes their spirit as having raised his own mood in the final hours before the invasion. His private diary entry for that same evening has a different register entirely. It acknowledges the weight of Lee Mallory's prediction. It returns to the strategic logic that had made the override necessary. No causeway exits, no Utah beach. No Utah beach, no viable beachhead, with the quality of a man re-arguing a case to himself rather than presenting it to others. Two documents written the same night by the same man, one for history, one for himself. The difference between them is the difference between what a supreme commander can admit in public and what he can think alone. And it's one of the more revealing documentary gaps in the entire Overlord archive. Lee Mallory had built his 50% prediction on two data sets, and understanding those data sets helps explain how he reached a number that proved significantly wrong in its immediate application, while being uncomfortably prescient about the campaign as a whole. The first data set was the Sicily disaster of July 1943, the friendly fire catastrophe that had killed more than 300 American paratroopers and destroyed 23 aircraft in a single night, an event that sat in the institutional memory of every senior Allied air commander like a splinter that couldn't be removed. The second was the German anti-aircraft density estimates for the Cotentin Peninsula, which his staff had extrapolated from reconnaissance data to produce a predicted casualty rate per aircraft per pass over defended territory. The problem with both datasets was that neither mapped cleanly onto the Albany scenario. The Sicily-friendly fire losses had occurred because the naval force hadn't been properly briefed on the aircraft routing, a coordination failure, not an anti-aircraft effectiveness measure. And the Cotentin anti-aircraft density, while real, was concentrated on the eastern coastal approaches, not the western route that Albany was specifically designed to avoid. Lee Mallory's prediction was methodologically coherent and operationally incorrect, in the way that professional risk assessments sometimes are when the model is applied to circumstances slightly different from the ones it was built to describe. What actually happened to the 101st on the night of June the 5th and 6th, 1944, was more complicated than either Lee Mallory's fear or Eisenhower's override anticipated. The immediate D-Day casualties for the 101st, the men killed, wounded, or missing on the day of the drop itself, were significant, but not the catastrophic 50% that the letter had predicted. They were somewhere between 15 and 20% of the force, depending on how you count the men who were missing but alive, versus the men who were genuinely casualties in the morning hours. Over the course of the Normandy campaign as a whole, extending from D-Day through mid-July, when the division was finally withdrawn to England, total 101st losses exceeded 4,600 men, approaching, in cumulative terms and over a longer time frame, something in the range of what Lee Mallory had feared would happen in a single night. He was wrong about the timing. The operations research question of whether he was wrong about the outcome is not as settled as the triumphalist reading of D-Day tends to suggest. Eisenhower watched the aircraft take off. Several accounts describe him standing on the field at Greenham Common, in the gathering dark, watching the C-47s of the 438th Troop Carrier Group roll down the runway and climb out over the English countryside. He stayed until the last aircraft disappeared. One account describes his eyes as glistening, though accounts of powerful men's emotional states and historical moments should always be read with a degree of skepticism. The observers who record these details are rarely disinterested. What can be said with more confidence is that he did not leave immediately. He remained on the field after the aircraft were gone. He then returned to his headquarters and wrote a draft message, accepting responsibility in case the invasion failed. He wrote that message before the first paratroopers' boots hit Norman soil. I find myself returning, in this research, to a detail that almost never gets its due weight: the chalk number system. The reason chalk numbers on fuselages and around paratroopers' necks matters isn't ceremonial. It was a functional accountability system, a way of ensuring that in the chaos of dark airfield operations, with 432 aircraft loading simultaneously across multiple fields, the right man got on the right plane. After the operation, the chalk numbers served a different purpose. By cross-referencing chalk numbers against aircraft manifests and post-mission unit reports, intelligence officers could begin reconstructing where each stick had actually landed, who had made it to their objectives, and who was missing. The chalk number on Strobel's neck in the Eisenhower photograph is the same chalk number that appears on an aircraft tail in a manifest record. It's the thread that connects a man's face in a photograph to a column of names in a casualty report. It's the bureaucratic infrastructure of mass-organized violence, made visible in one small laminated card. Lee Mallory would write Eisenhower a second letter after the operation, when it became clear that the immediate casualty predictions had been wrong. He wrote that he was glad to have been mistaken. He wrote it without defensiveness. He died in an aircraft accident in the French Alps in November of 1944, before the war ended, before the full campaign casualty figures were compiled. He never saw the numbers that might have partially complicated the gladness of his concession. The letter of relief is in the Eisenhower Library. It sits in the same archive as the letter of protest. Two letters about the same men, written 4 months apart, by a man who was right about the risk and wrong about the number, and honest about both, and who didn't live to see whether history would judge him for the fear or the accuracy. At 10:30 that evening, the engines were already turning at Greenham Common, and every other airfield in Berkshire and Wiltshire and Hampshire, where the 101st's C-47s were staged. Chalk 23 was in its serial. The men of the 502nd were aboard. The static lines were clipped. Somewhere over the English Channel, the Pathfinder teams that had already gone were crouching in Norman ditches with Eureka beacons and a handheld signal lamp, and the particular stillness of men who had done everything possible, and were now simply waiting to find out if it would be enough. The clouds they couldn't see from England were already there, over the Cotentin. The guns were already tracking sounds in the dark. The last aircraft of the first serial lifted off the runway. The night swallowed it. The 5th of June became the 6th, and Eisenhower stood alone on an English airfield, watching the darkness where his decision had gone. Chapter 7. Lost in Normandy. The Mathematics of Scatter Zero. 1:40 hours. The 6th of June, 1944. The last C-47 of Mission Albany banked away from the Cotentin Peninsula and set its nose back toward England. Below it, across 50 square miles of Norman countryside, bocage, flooded marsh, orchard, hedgerow, stone farmyard, rutted lane, 6,928 men were on the ground. The plan had called for them to be in 3 compact drop zones northeast of Cotentin, lettered Alpha, Charlie, and Delta, each roughly rectangular on the maps, each manageable enough for regiment-sized units to assemble from within an hour of landing. The map and the ground had almost nothing to do with each other. What the Albany scatter diagram shows, and it exists, this map, it's been reproduced in official histories, and it does not lie, is not a military drop pattern. It looks like something that fell from a great height and shattered on impact. Dots spread across the entire Cotentin, from the coast to inland positions many miles from any planned objective. Some sticks had landed inside the 82nd Airborne sector entirely. At least one documented account places a small group from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment more than 20 miles from Drop Zone Delta. 6,928 people were somewhere in the dark. Almost none of them knew where. The scatter map is a document I keep coming back to, because it says things that no narrative prose can quite replicate. When you look at it alongside the clean rectangles of the planned drop zones, the visual distance between intention and outcome is almost physically uncomfortable. The planned zones are neat. The actual landing distribution is not. The official post-mission assessment estimated that only roughly 16% of the force, approximately 1,100 men, were assembled under any recognizable form of command control by dawn. That leaves approximately 5,800 men scattered in small groups, pairs, and sometimes completely alone, across a landscape they'd studied on sand tables and aerial photographs, but had never walked, in darkness, under sporadic German fire, with no communications and no reliable way to know which direction held safety and which held a German patrol. The 101st Airborne Division had ceased to exist as a coherent military formation, approximately 90 minutes after the mission began. What replaced it was something harder to describe, but ultimately more interesting. A collection of individual decisions made by individual men, with whatever tools and companions the night had left them. Maxwell Taylor, the division commander, landed in a pasture near the village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Some accounts place it at roughly 01:30 hours, miles from his planned command position. He was alone. He had his pistol and his rank insignia, and the command authority of a major general, which was worth approximately nothing in a dark Norman field, without anyone around to command. He began moving toward the sound of other men, the soft double click of crickets in the hedgerows, the cautious calls of men trying to find out if the sound in the next field was a friend or an enemy. Over the next several hours, he assembled around himself a scratch force of approximately 13 men from at least 3 different units. He led them toward the nearest objective he could identify. He wrote later that he had been, for most of the morning, just another confused paratrooper, a phrase that contains a kind of honesty about the gap between command authority and operational reality that most generals don't commit to paper. The cricket clicker is worth pausing on, because it represents one of the more revealing engineering choices of the entire operation. 7,000 of them had been ordered from Acme Whistles in Birmingham, England, a simple brass pressure click toy, roughly the size of a large thumb, that produced a distinctive 2-click sound when the steel reed was pressed and released. 1 click from a man in the dark demanded 2 clicks in response. If you got 2 clicks back, you had found a friend. If you got silence, or the sound of boots in the undergrowth, you ran. The device was not a military invention. It was a child's toy, slightly adapted. The entire identification system for the most important airborne assault in history, the mechanism by which 6,000 scattered men were supposed to find each other in enemy-held darkness, cost approximately 3 cents each and came from a toy factory. I don't say this to diminish it. The system worked often enough. I say it because that contrast, the largest airborne drop in history, organized in part around a toy, tells you something important about the relationship between institutional planning and actual human ingenuity. The plans were grand. The solutions were small. The German response to the Albany scatter was not, as it might appear on first reading, a failure of military professionalism. It was a failure of information. The German 7th Army headquarters at Le Mans began receiving reports of Allied paratrooper landings almost immediately after the first sticks hit the ground. Multiple reports, from multiple locations, arriving simultaneously and covering an area so vast that no coherent picture was possible. By the official record, the 7th Army telephone log for the night of the 5th to 6th of June records dozens of separate contact reports from positions spanning more than 60 kilometers. The scatter that had ruined American unit cohesion had simultaneously destroyed German situational awareness. An army trying to determine where the main enemy effort is directed cannot function effectively when the enemy appears to be everywhere and nowhere at once. That wasn't planned. Nobody in the Albany planning documents wrote a paragraph about using dispersion as a confusion weapon. It was an accidental operational effect of a navigation failure, and it almost certainly prevented a coherent German counterattack in the hours when the 101st was most vulnerable. General Wilhelm Folly was the commander of the German 91st Air Landing Division, the specific German formation assigned to anti-airborne operations on the Cotentin Peninsula, one of the most capable formations in the German 7th Army's order of battle. He had been away from his headquarters on the night of the 5th of June, attending a map exercise at Rennes. When the first reports of Allied airborne activity reached him, he got in his staff car and drove back toward his headquarters near Picoville. It was still dark. The Norman roads were empty. He didn't know that scattered American paratroopers were moving through the countryside along precisely the routes a staff car would have to use to reach a headquarters on the western Cotentin. His car was ambushed. Accounts vary slightly on whether it was 82nd or 101st paratroopers involved, though the balance of evidence points toward the 82nd. On a road outside the rear wall of his own headquarters, he was killed. His aide-de-camp was killed with him. The 91st Air Landing Division, the unit specifically built and trained to crush an Allied airborne assault on the Cotentin, lost its commanding general to a chance encounter with scattered paratroopers at approximately 4 in the morning of the 6th of June, 1944. Nobody planned this. The scatter created it. What replaced divisional command cohesion in the hours after the Albany drop was something that the 101st's training had built in without explicitly naming it: the instinct of junior men to act on the mission rather than wait for orders. The training at Camp Toccoa and in England had stressed physical fitness and aggressiveness. It had also, by the account of many veterans, instilled a culture in which a sergeant with a specific objective and no officer present didn't stop and wait. He moved. Small groups formed around the nearest man who seemed to know what he was doing. Objectives were assigned to these improvised teams, not from divisional operations orders, but from whatever fragment of the plan the senior man present could remember. The La Barquette Lock, for instance, the 501st's critical objective on the Douve River, was captured by approximately 150 men assembled by Colonel Howard Johnson from scattered sticks of the 501st. Johnson had reached the lock by roughly 0400 hours, not with a regiment, with 150 men he'd collected in the dark. That's the 101st Airborne's D-Day story in miniature, not the division that was planned, the division that arrived. The post-mission analysis of what 16% command assembled strength actually meant in practice is one of the more instructive exercises in the documentary record. Of the 101st's 7 principal D-Day objectives, the Causeway exits, the La Barquette Lock, the highway bridges at Saint-Côme-du-Mont, and several smaller positions, almost all were either taken or contested by dawn on the 6th, not by battalions, not by companies operating under centralized command, by whatever groups had found each other in the dark and moved toward the sound of a clock ticking in their training. The division was broken into fragments. The fragments were functional. Whether that vindicates the plan that produced the fragments or merely speaks to the quality of the men who survived it is not a question I can answer cleanly, and I'm suspicious of anyone who thinks they can. Sometime in the early morning hours of the 6th of June, with German anti-aircraft fire still visible against the lightening sky to the east, and the sound of naval bombardment beginning to reach the interior of the Cotentin from the direction of the coast, the 101st Airborne Division was doing the only thing it had left. Small groups of men, in an unfamiliar landscape, moving toward objectives they half remembered from sand tables, carrying weapons and ammunition that was already being used at a rate the resupply plan hadn't fully accounted for, not knowing if the invasion had gone on or been repulsed or what the beaches looked like. They didn't know the outcome, they just kept moving. In the mathematics of scatter, that stubbornness was the only variable that had worked as planned. Chapter 8. The Screaming Eagles Find Each Other. The hedgerow that divided the field from the lane was 6 feet of tangled root and compacted earth, built up over centuries of Norman farming, and it was, at approximately 2 in the morning on the 6th of June, 1944, the most important geographical feature in one paratrooper's world. He'd landed in the field to one side of it. The sound of the double click when it came, 2 snaps of a brass cricket from somewhere in the darkness on the far side, was the first evidence he had that another American was alive and within reach. He clicked twice back. Boots shuffled through wet grass. A face appeared at the gap where a farm gate had once been. They didn't speak first. They looked at each other's patches in the gray dark. The screaming eagle visible on the shoulder, the same eagle on his own, and the calculation that had been running in each man's head since the jump door opened and the static line went tight, came briefly to rest. One more man. One more rifle. One more body between whatever was out there and whatever came next. Across the entire Cotentin Peninsula, in hundreds of hedgerows and ditches and orchards and lanes, this same scene was repeating itself like a human algorithm finding its own solution to the problem the planners had failed to solve. To me, the most underanalyzed part of the 101st Airborne's Normandy story isn't the drop itself. It's what happened in the 2 hours after it, in those dark fields, as men who'd never met before the previous evening assembled themselves into impromptu combat teams with almost no formal coordination. Historians who write about military operations tend to focus on command decisions made by named officers in documented locations. What the Ryan Archive reveals, when you read the individual accounts rather than the command summaries, is a different kind of organizational intelligence operating entirely below the level of the chain of command. The 101st's training had built in a specific cultural assumption that a paratrooper who landed alone behind enemy lines would not freeze. He would assess, he would orient. He would move toward the nearest sound of a friendly click and the nearest identifiable objective. That assumption turned out to be correct, often enough, for enough men to matter. The cricket clicker deserves more than a passing mention here, because its operational mechanics were both simpler and stranger than the official accounts typically describe. The device, issued at 1 per man before boarding, roughly the size and weight of a large coin, stamped from brass sheet and produced in Birmingham, England, produced a 2-note click when the steel reed was depressed. 1 click was a challenge. 2 clicks in response was the countersign. The system required no training beyond a single sentence of instruction. A man who'd never met you, in the dark, speaking no words, could establish his identity as a friend in 2 seconds flat. It was, by any reasonable measure, an elegant solution to an information problem. What it wasn't was foolproof. German soldiers in the Cotentin had been warned about the clicker system through intelligence channels. Some accounts in German prisoner interrogation reports suggest that at least some German troops used captured crickets or improvised imitations to lure paratroopers toward them. How widespread this practice was is genuinely unclear from the surviving record, and I've seen arguments on both sides. What seems certain is that by daylight, when the cricket system was no longer strictly necessary, it had done enough of its work. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers was from Company B, 1st Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. He was 25 years old. He'd worked as a coal miner in West Virginia before the war. On the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, he was near the hamlet of Les Mézières with a small force of roughly 15 men, drawn from multiple units, none of them from his own platoon, and in front of him was a complex of 11 farm buildings that contained a German artillery garrison. The buildings were fortified positions. The garrison was approximately 150 men. Summers did the arithmetic and decided it didn't apply to him. Over the next several hours, building by building, he cleared the complex in a series of assaults that witnesses described as being conducted with a quality of focused violence that existed somewhere between extreme training and the complete absence of fear. He used an M1 Garand rifle, then a Thompson submachine gun, then whatever weapon was to hand. Most of the other men didn't follow him into the buildings. They watched from cover, providing suppressing fire, too stunned or too rational to do what he was doing. By the end of the action, the German garrison had been neutralized. Summers was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration in the American military. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor twice. He didn't receive it. He received a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. He died in 1983. His action at Les Mézières is included, briefly, in some D-Day histories. Most don't mention it at all. What Summers accomplished at Les Mézières matters beyond its individual drama. And the individual drama is considerable, because the buildings he cleared contained an artillery position that the 101st's pre-mission planning had specifically identified as a threat to the Utah beach landing. A battery capable of directing fire onto the beach had been neutralized, not by an organized company assault executed according to a divisional plan, but by a sergeant from West Virginia who happened to land within walking distance of it and decided to deal with it himself. The connection between that single decision and the ships that made it safely onto Utah Beach is real, even if it's not calculable. That's the operational texture of what the 101st actually did on D-Day, not the planned operation, but the improvised one that ran parallel to it, and, in several critical places, achieved what the planned operation was supposed to. Taylor's improvised headquarters, assembled in and around the village of Highsville by mid-morning on the 6th, was operating in conditions that no divisional command post doctrine had prepared anyone for. The men around Taylor represented at least 4 different regimental affiliations. Radio communication with any of the 3 parachute infantry regiments was intermittent at best and frequently absent. Resupply was essentially nil. The parachute resupply mission on the afternoon of the 6th scattered its loads across a wide area, dropping equipment containers that many units never recovered. Taylor was commanding a division by collecting fragments of information from liaison officers who themselves had only fragments, trying to construct a picture of what was happening across a front measured in miles, from first-hand reports brought on foot from men who'd walked through German-held hedgerows to deliver them. He described the experience in his subsequent account with a plainness that reads almost like understatement. By his own characterization, the division commander of the 101st Airborne was operating for most of D-Day as a platoon leader with better information than most, and not much better resources. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment's experience on D-Day is in some ways the most representative of what the Albany scatter produced in practice. The 343rd Troop Carrier Group aircraft had dispersed badly in the cloud over the western Cotentin, but a significant portion, roughly 2/3 of the 1st Battalion, had landed on or near Drop Zone Charlie. That concentration, modest as it was enough to give the 1st Battalion something approaching coherent command structure. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wolverton had been killed in the jump, his parachute landing in a field near Angoville-aux-Plaines after his aircraft came in too fast and too low. But other officers assembled the available men and moved toward the Causeway objectives. By mid-afternoon on the 6th, elements of the 506th had reached the Howdianville Causeway exit. The 4th Infantry Division had already taken it from the beach side. The link-up happened. It was not elegant. It was not coordinated. It was two groups of American soldiers, moving toward the same point from opposite directions, arriving approximately simultaneously. That's what the Utah Beach Plan looked like at ground level. Improvised, functional, barely. The after-action accounts, the ones from the Ryan collection, the ones from survivors interviewed in the 1950s and 60s, share a quality that is hard to describe precisely, but unmistakable in aggregate. The men who were in the Cotentin on the night of the 5th and 6th of June don't describe themselves as participants in a historical event. They describe specific details: the smell of a particular hedgerow, the weight of wet equipment in a ditch, the sound of a tank engine in a lane 2 fields over, and the decision of whether to stay still or run. The particulars are local and sensory. The history is abstract. The archive holds both, imperfectly reconciled, and the gap between what those men experienced and what the operational summaries describe is the gap that every military history has to decide how to cross, or how to acknowledge that it can't. By dawn on the 6th of June, 1944, roughly 0600 hours, with a gray Norman light beginning to separate the hedgerows from the sky, the 101st Airborne Division's primary D-Day objectives were either taken or under assault by improvised groups that bore almost no organizational resemblance to the units that had boarded the C-47s the night before. The Utah Beach Causeway exits were contested. The Barquette lock was in American hands. The division existed as a fighting formation, in the way that a shattered mirror exists as a mirror. You could still see something in each piece. The men had found each other in the dark, one cricket click at a time. What they'd built from those encounters was not a division. It was something more durable, a set of individual decisions, each made without knowing what anyone else was doing, that added up, in aggregate, to something that worked. Chapter 9. The Filthy 13 and the Question of the Douve Bridges. Before they boarded their aircraft on the evening of the 5th of June, 1944, several men of the 1st Demolition Section, Regimental Headquarters Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, shaved their heads into mohawks. Jake McNeese, part Choctaw, former roughneck from Maysville, Oklahoma, leader of what the regiment had taken to calling the Filthy 13 on account of their creative relationship with personal hygiene regulations, had suggested the haircuts as a deliberate reference to the warrior traditions of Native American culture. He painted his own face with cosmoline, a dark, grease-based metal preservative, and some of the others did the same. Photographs taken at the airfield that evening show a row of men who look, in the half-light of the English summer evening, like something that doesn't fit neatly into any institutional category. They weren't performing for the camera. They were, by multiple accounts, genuinely getting their heads into a space that the mission required. The image went around the world after the war, was reproduced in books and magazines, and eventually inspired a novel and a Hollywood film that got almost everything about them factually wrong. And somewhere underneath the mythology, underneath the mohawks and the war paint and the Dirty Dozen Association, There is an actual after-action report that records the status of their primary D-Day objective in 3 words: not accomplished, D-Day. The Filthy 13's assigned mission on the 6th of June, 1944, was not a colorful sideshow. It was operationally critical. They were the first demolition section of the 506th PIR, directly commanded by Colonel Robert Sink, who had specifically chosen McNeese's unit for the assignment on the basis of their technical competence, rather than their reputation. Their task was to reach and destroy the highway bridges crossing the Douve River near Saint-Côme-du-Mont, the bridges that German forces would need to move infantry and armor southward toward Cotentin, and which, if left intact, would allow the German defenders to maintain a defensible corridor between the scattered American airborne units. The demolition charges for this work were carried partly on the men themselves, and partly in parapacks suspended beneath the aircraft, those external cylindrical containers that had already been identified in training documents as aerodynamically problematic. The plan was professionally conceived. The execution would be complicated by things neither McNeese nor anyone else in the planning chain had full control over. The drop on the night of the 5th and 6th dispersed the Filthy 13 across a wider area than the planned objective required. McNeese himself landed roughly on target, but with a reduced force. The scatter had taken several of his section to different fields and different hedgerows, where they were fighting their own individual crises in the dark. The parapacks, carrying a significant portion of the planned demolition charge, had been affected by the same high-speed aircraft runs that had scattered the parachute sticks. Containers designed for deployment at 110 miles per hour had been released at speeds considerably higher, and the resulting irregular parachute deployment had damaged several of them on impact. The explosive capacity that the demolition section actually had available when it reached the vicinity of the bridges was not what the planning documents had specified. The bridges required a specific weight of explosive, delivered in a specific placement to guarantee structural destruction. The section did not have what was needed. The highway bridges over the Douve at Saint-Côme-du-Mont were intact at midnight on the 6th of June. The 506th after-action report records this plainly, in the flat language of military documentation that doesn't soften operational failures for posterity. Here's the tension I've been sitting with in this chapter, and I want to be direct about it rather than paper over it. McNeese's own account of D-Day, preserved in interviews and in the memoir he later co-authored, describes a series of actions that emphasize improvised success and minimize the bridge objective's non-completion. The 506th PIR's official after-action report records a different picture. Both documents are available. They don't agree on the outcome of the bridge demolition task. That disagreement isn't unusual in military history. After-action reports and memoirs are different kinds of documents, written for different purposes, with different incentive structures governing what gets included and what gets softened. What matters operationally is what the unit diary records, because it was written in proximity to the events by men who were trying to account for their missions without the benefit of retrospect. And the unit diary says the bridges were intact. The operational consequence of intact bridges wasn't immediately catastrophic, but it was real and it was costly. German Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, the 6th Parachute Infantry Regiment, one of the finest light infantry formations in the Wehrmacht, commanded by Major Friedrich von der Heydt, held Saint-Côme-du-Mont until the 8th of June, and used the intact Douve crossings as part of its flexible defensive posture. The town was a blocking position that prevented the 501st and 506th PIRs from consolidating their positions south of the Cotentin marshes, and it extended the timeline for the advance on Cotentin itself by approximately 2 days. 2 days may not sound significant in a campaign that lasted months, but the junction of Utah and Omaha beaches, the operational necessity that had driven the entire Albany plan from its inception, was 2 days later because of a set of bridges that were supposed to have been blown on the night of the 5th and 6th and weren't. That's a straight line from a failed demolition mission to a strategic delay. McNeese's unit was, by every credible account, genuinely courageous on D-Day. The dispersion was not their fault. The parapacks were not their fault. The high-speed drops that damaged equipment containers were the result of pilot decisions made under flak, and those pilots weren't trying to compromise a demolition mission. They were trying not to die. What the Filthy 13 story reveals, when examined with some care rather than through the lens of the myth that accumulated around it after 1967, is something about the limits of unit-level excellence in a system-level failure. McNeese's men were good. The delivery system failed them. And the popular narrative, amplified enormously by a film that turned them into condemned criminals on a suicide mission, which they emphatically were not, has made it very difficult to have a clear-eyed conversation about what they were actually assigned to do and what actually happened. The Dirty Dozen film came out in 1967, 23 years after D-Day. By that point, the actual Filthy 13 had been largely absorbed into the folklore of the 101st Airborne, their mohawks and war paint, providing a visual shorthand that the entertainment industry found irresistible. E.M. Nathanson's novel, on which the film was based, had borrowed the unit's reputation for nonconformity and applied it to a fictional scenario involving military prisoners. The result was a cultural artifact that bore no operational relationship to the actual 1st Demolition Section's D-Day record, but that has colonized public memory of them so completely that explaining what they actually did and didn't do requires first dismantling what most people think they know. That's not a small task. It's the specific kind of historiographical work that institutional memory resists, because the myth is more satisfying than the record, and the men who lived it, understandably, preferred to be remembered as heroes rather than as participants in a complex and partially unsuccessful mission. Both things can be true. They are, in McNeese's case, simultaneously true. What the Douve Bridge story ultimately teaches, when set against the larger pattern of the Albany operation, is something about the relationship between individual capability and systemic reliability. You can have the best demolition section in the 101st Airborne Division. You can have them jump qualified, explosive certified, combat ready. You can put Jake McNeese in charge, and you can let him paint his face with cosmoline and shave his men's heads. And if the aircraft flying them in drops them at the wrong speed, in the wrong place, with damaged equipment containers, into a landscape that has been systematically flooded and defended by a German parachute regiment of the first quality, the individual capability of those men will not be sufficient to overcome the cumulative weight of system-level failure. That isn't an indictment of McNeese or his section. It is a description of what complex operations look like when multiple things go wrong at once. The Douve highway bridges were not destroyed on the 6th of June, 1944. They were, eventually, put out of service by other means over the following days. Saint-Côme-du-Mont fell on the 8th. The campaign moved south. Carentan waited. And Jake McNeese, who would go on to serve with the Pathfinders at Bastogne in December of that year, a mission whose own story deserves its own chapter, lived until the 21st of January, 2013, outlasting most of his section and most of his critics, carrying the weight of a famous photograph and an incomplete mission, and a movie that had nothing to do with either. Chapter 10. The Parachute That Was Never Redesigned. The evening of the 5th of June, 1944, in a maintenance hangar at one of the 9th Troop Carrier Command's Southern English airfields, a parachute rigger was at his table. In front of him, a T-5 parachute assembly, 28-foot cotton ripstop canopy, folded into its deployment bag, 28 suspension lines, quick-release harness, reserve chute attachment. He'd packed hundreds of them. The motion was automatic. Fan the canopy, fold in thirds, accordion the excess, close the deployment bag flaps with a specific pull-through that guaranteed the opening sequence would go in the right order. Thread the static line through the deployment bag keeper. Check the loop, check the connector snap. Close the pack tray, check the closing ties. Sign the packing data card. Move to the next. Each of those cards carried a serial number. Each serial number would be attached to a specific chalk number on a specific aircraft. Somewhere in that chain of paper, every paratrooper in Mission Albany had a traceable line running from his harness, through a rigger's signature, through an aircraft manifest, to a name in a unit roster. The bureaucracy was complete. The parachute was ready. The physics of what the parachute could and couldn't survive were also fixed, had been fixed since the design was approved, and nobody was going to change them before the aircraft rolled. The T-5 parachute system was not, by the standards of 1944, a poorly designed piece of equipment. It needs to be said clearly, because what follows is a description of its failure modes, and failure mode analysis requires a baseline of what the system was actually designed to do. The T-5 was a static line deployed, mass drop parachute, built for reliability and uniformity across a large number of simultaneous jumpers. Its 28-foot canopy was designed to slow a fully loaded paratrooper to a landing speed of approximately 14 to 20 feet per second, a hard but survivable impact for a man who'd been trained in the parachute landing fall, the specific roll and absorb technique that distributed landing impact across the feet, calf, thigh, hip, and shoulder in a prescribed sequence. The canopy deployed in approximately 2 to 3 seconds from static line extension at the prescribed drop speed of 110 miles per hour and the prescribed minimum drop altitude of 400 feet above the ground. At those parameters, the system worked. It was extensively tested. The parameters were known. The question of what happened when the parameters were violated, and they were violated, routinely, on the night of the 6th of June, is where the engineering record becomes uncomfortable. At 160 miles per hour, which is the speed some Albany aircraft were flying when their men jumped, 50 miles per hour above the prescribed maximum, the opening shock of a T-5 parachute deployment increased substantially beyond the design envelope. The precise figures vary by source, but the physiological consequence was documented in the 326th Medical Company's after-action report, which records a pattern of orthopedic and soft tissue injuries among D-Day jumpers that are clearly distinguishable from combat wounds by their mechanism and location: clavicle fractures, shoulder separations, torn ligaments and dislocated joints in the hip and knee. These are the injuries you get when a rapidly deploying parachute canopy catches air at excessive speed and applies severe decelerative force to a harness that is attached to a human body. The men weren't hit, they were snapped. And the after-action medical record treats these injuries as a separate category, jump injuries, distinct from combat wounds, in a way that the divisional casualty summaries do not. The divisional summaries lump everything together. The medical company's report separates them. The separation matters. The altitude problem was equally documented and equally consequential. The prescribed minimum drop altitude for the T-5 was 400 feet above ground level. The planned Albany drop altitude was 700 feet, a safety margin of 300 feet above minimum, which under normal conditions would absorb minor altitude variations. German anti-aircraft fire caused some aircraft to fly below their prescribed altitude, in several documented cases, substantially below. Men who jumped from aircraft at 300 feet or less had parachutes that hadn't fully deployed when their boots touched the ground. The T-5 needed roughly 150 to 200 feet of altitude to go from packed bag to fully inflated canopy, a deployment sequence that takes approximately 2 seconds at correct speed. From 300 feet, the math leaves very little room. The 326th Medical Company's report records multiple fatal and near-fatal impact injuries, consistent with partial deployment. These men weren't shot. The altitude killed them. And the altitude was determined not by any enemy action, but by the decisions of frightened pilots, doing what human beings do when tracer rounds start coming up through the aircraft floor. The T-5's harness quick-release mechanism deserves its own examination, separate from the drowning problem I described in an earlier chapter, because the engineering decision that created it predates Normandy by 3 years, and the logic behind it was entirely sound in the operational context for which it was designed. The quick-release box, a circular metal housing on the chest strap, roughly 3 inches in diameter, with a half-turn lock and a central press button, had replaced an earlier multi-snap harness system after testing showed that paratroopers landing in high winds could be dragged across the ground by a still-inflated canopy before they could release individual snaps at each attachment point. The single-point release solved that problem completely. One twist, one push, and the entire harness fell free in under a second. The problem was that the twist and push motion was a two-handed action requiring fine motor coordination, pressing one hand's fingers into the locking collar, while the thumb of the other hand pressed the central release button. In the cold, in the dark, in 3 feet of German inundated marsh water, inverted or semi-inverted under the weight of 100 pounds of equipment, with the canopy pulling the whole assembly backward against the current, that two-handed fine motor action was the difference between life and the alternative. The record says this killed men. The harness was not redesigned before D-Day. After Normandy, modifications began. The lesson required a specific number of bodies before it was formally incorporated into an equipment change. What troubles me most, reading through the T-5's operational history in the context of the Albany mission, is not the equipment failures themselves. Equipment operates at the edge of its parameters in combat. That is essentially the definition of combat. But the institutional distance between what the training records predicted and what the planners acknowledged. The April 4th training exercise, in poor visibility, had produced scattered drops that were logged and then described as weather-related anomalies. The T-5's altitude and speed dependencies were fully documented in its design specifications, which were not classified. The specific vulnerability of the quick-release mechanism in water was a known property of the design. None of these facts appear anywhere in the pre-mission planning documents as items requiring mitigation before the 6th of June. They appear in post-mission analysis documents. In military planning, the distance between pre-mission risk acknowledgement and post-mission analysis is frequently measured in the casualties that accumulate between the two. The parapacks, those external fuselage containers that carried the heaviest equipment, deserve a specific technical moment here because they sit at the intersection of the altitude problem, the speed problem, and the Filthy 13's bridge demolition failure. The M1 demolition parapack system was a cylindrical container deployed via its own parachute from the aircraft's external carriage frame. At the prescribed drop speed, the deployment sequence worked cleanly. At significantly higher speeds, the aerodynamic forces on the pack during initial deployment created tumbling, irregular rotation that could cause the pack's own parachute to deploy improperly, wrapping around the container rather than streaming clear of it. A tumbling parapack didn't slow down to parachute-retarded descent speed. It fell at close to ballistic velocity. The equipment crates inside were designed to survive parachute delivery. Several of them were not designed to survive what amounted to an uncontrolled drop from 1,000 feet. The explosive materials, fortunately, survived impact better than precision equipment, but the detonators and fusing components, the parts that required precise physical integrity, did not always fare as well. Nobody blamed the pilots. Nobody blamed the parapack designers. The failure distributed itself across the entire system, which is how complex failures usually work, and which is why complex failures are so difficult to assign and so easy to forget. The packing card for every T-5 that jumped into Normandy bore a rigger's serial number. In the maintenance records, those serial numbers connect to names, men who checked the work, signed their approval, and sent 6,928 parachutes on their way. Every box on those cards was checked. The riggers did their job. The parachutes opened, mostly, as designed. The system operated at the boundary of its specifications, mostly within them, occasionally beyond them, and the casualties that resulted from exceeding those specifications are in the medical record, distinguished by injury pattern from the casualties that came from German guns, and largely invisible in the divisional casualty summaries that most histories use as their primary data source. The parachute was never redesigned before D-Day. It was modified after. The modification came too late for the men who needed it on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, in the flooded fields of the Cotentin, with the static lines already cut and the aircraft already gone back to England. Chapter 11. Cotentin, the mission that wasn't on the D-Day map. The 8th of June, 1944. A stone building in the center of Cotentin, a market town of a few thousand inhabitants at the junction of the Douve and Taute rivers, about 10 miles south of Utah Beach. German Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 had been holding it for 2 days against increasingly intense American pressure from the scattered but steadily consolidating paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. The town was not in the 101st's original D-Day operations order. Search the Albany planning documents, and you won't find Cotentin as an objective. The original mission was the Causeways, the Barquette Lock, and the Douve bridges, the Utah Beach flank, the internal Cotentin corridor. Cotentin was the mission that arrived on the 7th of June, when the strategic picture had clarified enough for the first time for senior commanders to see what the extended situation actually required. Taylor received the expanded mission from 7th Corps. The division that had been awake and fighting for 36 hours was now also going to take a town held by some of Germany's most capable infantry. The fact that it eventually did so is not simple. The cost at which it did so is not small. And the gap between the D-Day story that ends at the beach and the story that ends at Cotentin represents one of the larger omissions in the popular history of Operation Overlord. Cotentin mattered for one reason that superseded all tactical considerations. It was the town through which the road and rail connections between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach ran. Without control of Cotentin, the two American beachheads, Utah and Omaha, separated by roughly 20 miles of coastline and the flooded Duve marshes, could not be linked into a continuous American line. A gap between the two beachheads was a potential insertion point for a German armored counterattack that could drive to the coast, cut Utah off from reinforcement, and potentially roll up the entire American sector. Closing that gap was not a preference. It was a strategic necessity of the First Order, and the 101st Airborne was the only American force in position to close it. The division that had jumped into Normandy to secure 4 causeways behind a beach was now being asked, after 60 hours of continuous combat without adequate resupply, to seize a fortified town held by 3,500 first-rate German parachute infantry. The approaches to Cotentin forced a geometry that the 101st's commanders couldn't redesign away. The town sat at the center of a system of flooded marshes and river channels, the same Rommel-engineered inundation that had already killed men on the night of the drop. And the passable approaches were elevated causeways, narrow, straight roads raised on embankments above the surrounding water, exposed to direct fire from prepared positions at their far ends, with no cover on either side beyond the edges of the road itself. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment's assault along the main causeway, approaches on the 10th and 11th of June, resulted in casualty rates that the regimental surgeon's records describe in clinical language that doesn't fully conceal the operational reality underneath. Men advancing along a 12 to 15 foot wide raised road, in single file because formation width was physically impossible, under fire from stone buildings at the causeway's far end, with flooded marsh 20 feet below on both sides. Medieval choke point, modern weapons. The assault pressed on. The German defense of Cotentin was conducted by Major Friedrich von der Heydt's Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, with a professionalism that American accounts of the battle have historically underestimated. Von der Heydt was not holding the town to the last man in the rigid Haltebefehl tradition. He was applying elastic defense, the doctrine of deliberate withdrawal under pressure to secondary positions, followed by counterattack when the attacker had overextended. His regiment yielded the causeway approaches slowly, ceding ground only when holding it became operationally expensive, falling back through the town toward prepared positions to the south. The Americans pushing through the causeways were advancing, but they were advancing into a defense that was giving them just enough ground to consume their momentum. The town itself fell in the early hours of the 12th of June, when von der Heydt assessed that continued defense was no longer operationally viable, and withdrew his regiment southward. The 506th PIR's field log entry, noting contact with Omaha Beach elements at a road junction south of the town, records the moment the two American beachheads were linked. It is written in pencil on a field message form, in handwriting that is slightly unsteady in the way handwriting gets when the man holding the pencil hasn't slept properly in 6 days. Below the formal entry, someone wrote a single word: finally. What I find genuinely striking when I put the Cotentin casualty figures against the pre-mission planning documents is how thoroughly the cost of the Cotentin battle falls outside the accounting that D-Day histories typically perform. The standard measure of the Albany operation's success or failure focuses on D-Day itself, the causeway exits, the La Barquette lock, the initial scatter and consolidation. The Cotentin battle, which lasted from roughly the 8th through the 13th of June, accounted for a substantial portion of the 101st's total Normandy losses. The 502nd's casualties on the causeway approaches alone represented a significant fraction of the regiment's effective strength. These men are casualties of the Normandy operation. They are not casualties of D-Day. The distinction matters in the historical accounting because it determines which losses get assigned to the airborne plan and which get assigned to subsequent operational decisions. If you count D-Day, the airborne operation looks expensive but tolerable. If you count through Cotentin, the arithmetic changes. The German counterattack on the 13th of June, a day after Cotentin fell, nearly reversed everything. A German SS armored formation struck the 101st's positions at what the survivors called Bloody Gulch, a field south of the town where the 502nd was holding a line with insufficient strength and no artillery support. The attack came in force, and it hit a division that had been in continuous combat for a week, was short of ammunition, had not been properly resupplied, and was holding a wider front than its effective strength warranted. Elements of the 2nd Armored Division arrived from Utah Beach in time to stabilize the position. Without them, the historical judgment of the Carentan battle might be very different. The 101st held Carentan. They held it because somebody else arrived in time. That's not a failure. That's how coalition warfare works. But it's a detail that the celebratory version of the story tends to soften. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment's role in the Carentan approach deserves a specific note, because Colonel Howard Johnson's men had been fighting effectively for 6 days, since Johnson himself had assembled 150 scattered paratroopers and taken the La Barquette lock at 0400 on the 6th. Johnson was one of those commanders who seemed to function better in chaos than in order. Energetic, aggressive, physically present at the front in a way that junior men found either inspiring or terrifying, depending on the day. His regiment had taken significant casualties in the D-Day drop and the subsequent actions around the Douve marshes, and the men pressing toward Carentan from the east on the 9th and 10th were operating on reduced strength, reduced sleep, and the specific kind of motivation that comes from having fought this hard for this long, and not being willing to let it have been for nothing. That's not military doctrine. It's the operational psychology of men who've already paid a price and can't afford to have it come to nothing. The town of Carentan was liberated on the 12th of June, 1944. 6 days after D-Day, 5 days after the mission to take it had been assigned to a division that hadn't planned for it, on a timetable that was behind the operational schedule by nearly a week. The gap between Utah and Omaha was closed. The 2 American beachheads were linked. The strategic objective that had driven the entire Allied right flank from its inception was achieved. And the men who achieved it, the men who jumped into the dark on the night of the 5th, scattered across the Cotentin, assembled themselves from fragments in the hedgerows, secured the causeways and the lock, and then turned south toward a town that wasn't on their original orders, were relieved from the line, and returned to England at the end of June, having lost roughly 4,600 men killed, wounded, and missing since they'd boarded their chalk-numbered aircraft. That number is not on the Utah Beach Memorial. It belongs there. Chapter 12. The Glider Soldiers Nobody Talks About. 01:15 on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, over the Norman coast, in the same darkness and the same cloud bank that was at that moment scattering the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment across 20 miles of Cotentin countryside. A formation of CG-4A Waco gliders crossed the coastline at approximately 2,000 feet, towed by C-47 Skytrains on steel tow cables. The men inside the gliders were not paratroopers. They wore the same Screaming Eagle patch. They'd trained alongside the parachute infantrymen. But they had not jumped. They were going to land. The difference between those 2 modes of arrival might seem technical until you understand the specific character of arriving in a glider, at night, onto an unknown Norman field, in an aircraft that had no engine, no brakes of any meaningful effectiveness on wet grass, no possibility of going around if the field was wrong, and no alternative to whatever the next 30 seconds produced. The paratrooper has the door. He has the moment of decision. He steps through or he doesn't. The glider soldier sits down, straps in, and waits for the ground to find him. He is a passenger in a wooden box aimed at France. He will ride it wherever it goes. The CG-4A Waco was, in the vocabulary of military aviation, a disposable vehicle. That's not a figurative description. There was no plan to recover the gliders after the Normandy operation. They were manufactured, used once, and abandoned in Norman fields where they came to rest. And that was always the plan. 13,909 of them were built during the war. Each one cost approximately $15,000 in 1944 money. The construction was fabric over tubular steel and wood. Grade A cotton doped with cellulose acetate butyrate, applied wet, shrinking taut as it dried to produce a wing surface that, in ideal conditions, was aerodynamically efficient enough to carry 3,700 pounds of payload over a useful glide distance. The wingspan was 83 feet and 7 inches. The landing speed, the speed at which it touched the ground with no engine to vary the approach, was approximately 60 to 65 miles per hour. It had no brakes that could meaningfully arrest its ground roll on wet grass. On a runway, with lights and known ground conditions, it was manageable. In a dark Norman field, possibly flooded, possibly staked with Rommel's asparagus poles, at night, with German anti-aircraft fire tracking it from below. It was a wooden box going 60 miles per hour toward whatever the next few seconds held. The 101st Airborne's glider operations on the 6th of June were divided into two main missions. Operation Chicago, a night glider lift carrying command elements and equipment shortly after the parachute drops, and Operation Detroit, a daytime lift that followed on the afternoon of D-Day. Brigadier General Don Pratt, the assistant division commander of the 101st, the second highest-ranking officer in the division, flew into Normandy aboard a CG-4A in Mission Chicago. His glider, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Mike Murphy, overshot its designated landing zone after the aircraft picked up excessive ground speed on the wet grass. Some accounts suggest the addition of steel armor plate beneath the cockpit for Pratt's protection had added weight that compromised the landing run. The glider ran into a line of trees at the edge of the field. Pratt was killed in the impact. Murphy was severely injured. Don Pratt became the highest-ranking Allied officer killed on D-Day. He died in a wooden box built by the Waco Aircraft Company of Troy, Ohio, that had been judged by its delivery system's own standards as airworthy, barely, and had proven accurate in the second word, but misleading in the first. I want to say something directly about why this chapter exists at all, because the question of why the glider infantry has been so thoroughly excluded from the popular memory of D-Day is not an innocent historiographical oversight. The paratrooper has a mythology. The jump door, the green light, the static line. These images have been reproduced in photographs, films, and memorial sculptures thousands of times. They carry a specific cultural weight in the American narrative of the war. The glider soldier has none of that. He boarded an aircraft that flew without an engine. He arrived not with the sharp agency of a jump, but with the passive violence of a crash landing. His patch was the same eagle. His training was comparable. His casualty rates in some operations exceeded the parachute infantry's. And he has been, with a consistency that suggests something more than accident, largely left out of the story that the culture tells about what the 101st Airborne was and what it did. The omission isn't a mystery. The mythology requires a specific kind of arrival, and the glider doesn't provide it. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment's D-Day story is, itself, unusual enough to complicate the already complicated picture of what the 101st actually did on the 6th of June. Most of the 327th did not arrive in Normandy by glider on D-Day. The regiment came ashore across Utah Beach, on landing craft, with the 4th Infantry Division. The soldiers who wore the 327th's patch on D-Day performed what was, technically, an amphibious landing. The Glider Infantry Regiment performed an amphibious assault. This fact is almost never stated in popular accounts of the 101st Normandy operation, which is remarkable given how thoroughly it upends the image of the all-airborne division conducting an all-airborne assault. The decision had been made on the basis of known glider landing hazards. The asparagus poles, the flooded fields, the darkness, and it was professionally sound. But it produces the operational irony that the unit whose patch says glider arrived by sea, and the unit whose records show the worst landing accuracy, arrived by glider at night into a field that wasn't ready for them. The Rommel-Spargel poles in the Norman landing zones were between 4 and 5 meters tall, rough-cut timber, about 8 to 12 inches in diameter, driven into the ground at 45-degree angles across open fields. They were spaced at intervals intended to catch a glider's wing root or fuselage on approach, and in their more lethal installations, they were topped with artillery shells or mines designed to detonate on contact. The aerial photographs taken in April and May of 1944 had identified the poles in the Cotentin's open fields, and the landing zones for Mission Chicago had been selected partly on the basis of pole density, the least infested available fields rather than the pole-free ones, because the pole-free ones didn't exist in sufficient numbers and size. Several of the gliders in Mission Chicago hit poles on landing. The pilot accounts and the post-mission debrief documents describe the landing sequences in language that makes no effort to minimize the violence of what happened when a 60-mile-per-hour aircraft met a fixed wooden stake at wing root height. The aircraft stopped very quickly. The contents did not. Mission Detroit, the afternoon glider mission, told a different story, and the contrast is worth pausing over because it maps directly onto the larger question about night versus day operations that runs through this entire series. The daylight gliders flew over terrain their pilots could see. They identified landing zones that their maps corresponded to. The landing accuracy was substantially higher than Mission Chicago's. The German anti-aircraft fire was more effective because the guns could track a visible target. But the landing concentration was better, and the equipment arrived in better condition. The anti-tank guns and jeeps that the division desperately needed for the Cotentin approaches were delivered more reliably in daylight than in darkness. The same trade-off that applied to the parachute drops applied here. Night provided concealment and also provided chaos. Day provided accuracy and also provided exposure. The command decision to use night for the initial assault had been made on sound grounds. The data from the glider missions suggests the balance point between those two variables was not quite where the planners had set it. General Pratt's glider had a serial number, CG-4-A 43-41047, registered in the 9th Troop Carrier Command's aircraft records. The maintenance log for that aircraft includes a pre-mission inspection entry noting the aircraft as airworthy. The steel armor plates added to the cockpit floor, an improvised protective modification made for Pratt's comfort and safety, are not mentioned in the standard maintenance log because they were added informally, outside the standard modification channel. They added weight. That weight extended the landing roll. The landing roll put the aircraft into the trees. The informal modification that was supposed to protect him became, through the mechanics of a 65-mile-per-hour ground roll on wet Norman grass, the thing that contributed to his death. There is something in that chain of events, the good intention, the informal workaround, the physics that don't care about intentions. That feels like a summary of the entire Albany operation. Everything was done with good reason. Several things went wrong anyway. The men paid for it. The CG-4A gliders that Mission Chicago deposited across the Norman countryside in the early hours of the 6th of June were not recovered. They sat in Norman fields for weeks, some of them for months, until local farmers dismantled them for the timber and the aluminum fittings. The fabric was sometimes used to make clothing. The steel tubing was bent and cut and repurposed. The aircraft that had carried men from England to France, that had gone 60 miles per hour into dark Norman fields and stopped in hedgerows and tree lines and flooded ditches, became building materials, a farming economy finding use for what a war had deposited in its fields. The glider infantry who had ridden them, the ones who survived, went on to Cotentin and beyond. Most accounts don't mention how they arrived. That omission is this chapter's subject and its conclusion. Chapter 13, What Lee Mallory Got Wrong and What He Got Right. The 14th of November, 1944, an Avro York transport aircraft, registration MW126, departed an airfield near Paris, carrying Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory, his wife, and 8 other passengers and crew, bound for Ceylon, where Lee Mallory was to take command of Southeast Asia Air Forces. The aircraft encountered severe weather in the French Alps. It struck a mountain slope near the village of La Rivière d'Alemont, at a height later estimated at approximately 2,000 meters. All 10 on board were killed. There were no survivors. The man who had formerly predicted the futile slaughter of 2 fine divisions, who had been wrong about the number and partially right about the risk, who had written a second letter to Eisenhower after the operation, acknowledging his error gladly. That man died in a transport aircraft, in bad weather, over mountains, in precisely the kind of accident that no forecast can prevent. He never saw the full campaign figures for the Normandy airborne operations. He never knew how close his second letter's confidence had been to requiring revision. He never had to sit with the complete arithmetic. The Alps saw to that on a November afternoon, 5 months after D-Day. The letter Lee Mallory wrote to Eisenhower before the operation is among the most consequential pieces of paper in the D-Day documentary record. He predicted 70% casualties among glider forces and 50% casualties among paratroopers. He called the planned airborne assault a potential futile slaughter. He used the word futile in a formal written communication to the Supreme Allied Commander and underlined it in ink in the original document. Eisenhower read this letter on the evening of the 31st of May, 1944, sat with it, and overruled it. He described the decision in his diary as soul-racking. Not difficult, not hard, soul-racking. A phrase that tells you something about the weight of sending men into a danger that an expert has formally quantified and you formally decided to accept anyway. Eisenhower drove to Greenham Common that evening and walked among the men the letter was about. He was there when the aircraft took off. He stayed on the field until the last one was gone. Now, what actually happened, and what does it tell us about the quality of the prediction? The immediate D-Day casualties for the combined American Airborne Force, 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions together, were somewhere between 15 and 20% on D-Day itself, substantially below Lee Mallory's 50% paratrooper figure. The glider missions suffered significantly less than his predicted 70% among glider forces. Measured strictly against the night's immediate outcome, the prediction looks like a significant overestimate. That's the reading that Eisenhower's vindication narrative requires, and it's supported by the numbers, but it's also incomplete. The full D-Day through June 30th casualties for the 101st alone were 4,670, 546 killed, 2,217 wounded, and 1,907 missing. That's 4,670 people from a force of approximately 13,000 that began the campaign. A casualty rate approaching 36% in the first 25 days, not counting the quarantine operations that extend the accounting further. Lee Mallory was catastrophically wrong about the first night. He was not nearly as wrong about the campaign. Here's the methodological problem that makes this debate genuinely difficult rather than merely contentious. Lee Mallory's prediction specified a time frame, the immediate operation, and was wrong by a large margin for that time frame. The casualty figures that approach something like his predicted numbers come from a much longer period and include battles, Carentan, the hedgerow fighting, the Bloody Gulch counterattack, that weren't part of the airborne drop plan at all. You can't straightforwardly vindicate a prediction about D-Day night casualties by pointing to 3 weeks of subsequent ground combat. But you also can't entirely dismiss a prediction that identified the correct order of magnitude for the campaign's human cost, even if its timing was wrong. The honest position, and I think it is the most defensible one, is that Lee Mallory correctly identified the structural vulnerabilities of the operation, the night navigation requirement, the flak corridors, the drop zone inaccuracy. He overestimated their immediate lethal effect because he didn't model for German command paralysis, for the confusion value of scatter, for Falley's death on a dark road, for the tenacity of men who found each other in hedgerows and kept moving anyway. His casualty model was based on what should have happened. What actually happened was something different, and no model built on operational logic accounts for the specific contingencies that make history. The Sicily methodology problem is worth being precise about, because it goes to the heart of how professional military risk assessment can produce a confident wrong answer. Lee Mallory's staff drew substantially on the Sicily airborne disaster of 1943, the friendly fire incident in which Allied naval vessels shot down 23 American C-47s over the Mediterranean, as their calibration data for airborne casualty rates. The problem is that Sicily's losses were a coordination failure, not an anti-aircraft effectiveness measure. The naval guns that destroyed those aircraft weren't defending against an airborne assault with particular skill. They were firing in a panic at unidentified aircraft that crossed their sector after an earlier German air attack had put them on a hair trigger. The Cotentin flak environment was different, denser in some areas, lighter in others, with the Albany routing specifically designed to avoid the heaviest concentrations. Applying a Sicily-derived casualty coefficient to a Normandy scenario was methodologically inappropriate in a way that Lee Mallory's staff doesn't appear to have fully examined. The prediction was confidently wrong, partly because the underlying data set was the wrong one. When I'm reading through the post-operation assessments, the first 10 troop carrier command analysis, the USAF official history by Warren, the 101st Divisional after-action documents, what strikes me is the absence of any explicit formal declaration that the night drop methodology had been proven unsound. The evidence is there. The comparison between the scattered night drops and the accurate daytime glider and resupply missions, flown by the same pilots over the same terrain under heavier fire, is documented in the same records. The lesson that the night was the problem, not the pilots, not the aircraft, not the men, is visible in the data, and yet no formal doctrinal document was issued after Normandy stating that night mass parachute drops should not again be attempted. What happened instead was that the next 3 major Allied airborne operations, Market Garden in September of 1944, Varsity in March of 1945, and Dragoon in August of 1944, were all conducted in daylight. The lesson was absorbed without being announced. The institutional culture changed its practice without changing its stated doctrine. That gap between what an organization does and what it officially says it learned is one of the most persistent features of military institutional history, and the Normandy night drop is one of its cleaner examples. Lee Mallory's second letter, the one he wrote to Eisenhower after the operation, acknowledging his error, is a document I find more interesting in some ways than the protest letter that preceded it. The protest letter is courage, the courage of a senior officer formally dissenting from an approved plan, on the record, in his own hand. The second letter is something else. It is the specific gladness of a man who was afraid he had been right and found out he was wrong, and who had the decency to say so plainly. He wrote that he was glad to have been wrong, not defensive, not hedged, glad. There's a human quality in that word, sitting in its official context, that the formal record of the Allied High Command doesn't often produce. He wrote it, sent it, and 5 months later got on an aircraft in bad weather and didn't come back. The gladness was genuine. The Alps didn't ask about it. The historiographical debate that has accumulated around Lee Mallory's prediction since 1944 is, at its core, a debate about what metric you use to evaluate a complex military operation. If you measure by D-Day objectives achieved, Causeways taken, German command disrupted, Utah Beach secured, the airborne drop was a success, and Lee Mallory was wrong. If you measure by proportionality, were the strategic gains worth the human cost at the rate it was incurred, the answer is considerably less comfortable and depends heavily on your counterfactual assumptions about what a daylight drop would have cost. If you measure by institutional learning, did the military correctly understand why it succeeded and what it should change? The answer is that the correct lesson was absorbed informally and never formally articulated, which is its own kind of institutional failure, even when the operation technically worked. All three measurements are legitimate. None of them is complete, and anyone who tells you confidently that the night drop was clearly right or clearly wrong hasn't read the whole record. One figure, 4,670. That's the 101st Airborne's total casualties for the Normandy campaign through June 30th. Not the night, not D-Day, the campaign. 546 of them were killed. The rest were wounded or missing. Some of the missing came back, some didn't. In the autumn of 1944, when the division was refitting in England after Normandy and preparing for Market Garden, some of those men came back to units that had been partially rebuilt around their replacements. The ones who'd been at Greenham Common with Eisenhower, and at Les Maizières with Summers, and at La Barquette in the dark with Colonel Johnson and 150 strangers, those men knew things about the Cotentin that the replacement drafts could read about in unit histories, but couldn't learn any other way. Lee Mallory was right about the cost, in the end. He was just wrong about when it would come. Chapter 14. The German Side. Who was supposed to stop them? The evening of the 5th of June, 1944, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falley, commanding officer of the German 91st Air Landing Infantry Division, was not at his headquarters near Picoville on the western Cotentin Peninsula. He was in Rennes, roughly 120 kilometers to the south, attending a map exercise, a command war game organized by the German 7th Army to rehearse the defense against the Allied invasion that everyone in the German High Command knew was coming, but whose timing and location remained uncertain enough to produce the specific paralysis of excessive preparation. Falley had left his headquarters, left his division, and gone to a planning exercise while his unit held the most strategically exposed position on the Cotentin. German tactical regulations permitted this. The weather forecast for the channel had suggested no invasion was imminent. At 11:30 on the night of the 5th, the weather was deteriorating over the channel, and the German Meteorological Service had assessed conditions as unsuitable for a major landing. Falley was at a dinner table in Rennes with other senior officers, discussing possibilities. By midnight, the possibilities had become realities, and he was in a staff car driving north in the dark toward a headquarters that was about to become the center of the most consequential night operation in the history of airborne warfare. The German 91st Air Landing Division was not a garrison formation. It needs to be understood clearly for what it was, because the popular English-language account of D-Day tends to treat German forces on the Cotentin as a somewhat passive obstacle, rather than as a professional military force with its own organizational logic. The 91st had been specifically relocated to the Cotentin in the spring of 1944 after German intelligence assessments correctly identified the peninsula as a likely Allied airborne objective. It was a fully mobile division, not a static coastal unit, built and equipped for anti-airborne operations, with its own artillery, reconnaissance, and motorized infantry. Its authorized strength, counting OKW reserve elements that fell under its operational control, was substantial. It had been positioned, trained, and mentally prepared to do exactly what it was about to fail to do: defeat an Allied airborne assault on the Cotentin. The question of why it failed is not a question about equipment or numbers. It is a question about command. The German 7th Army telephone log for the hours between midnight and 6 in the morning on the 6th of June, 1944, is one of the stranger documents in the Normandy archive. Reading it gives you the German side of the same informational chaos that was simultaneously preventing Maxwell Taylor from knowing where any of his regiments were. Report after report arrives at 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans. Paratroopers near Saint-Mère-Église, paratroopers near Cotentin, paratroopers in the area of the Douve, paratroopers on the western coast, paratroopers 20 kilometers inland. Many entries are annotated with the German military shorthand for unconfirmed or location unclear. By 4 in the morning, the telephone log records 47 separate contact reports, distributed across more than 60 kilometers of front, with no coherent picture emerging from any of them. The scatter that had shattered the 101st's unit cohesion had simultaneously destroyed the 7th Army's intelligence picture. You can't concentrate your reserves against a main effort if you can't find the main effort. You can't issue movement orders to a divisional commander who is driving north in a staff car through an occupied countryside full of armed Americans he doesn't know are there. The account of Falley's death is verified from multiple sources, including German records and post-war accounts, and it is worth staying with for a moment because of what it represents operationally. He had been trying to return to his headquarters at the Château de Berneville, near Picoville. The road from Rennes runs north through the Cotentin interior. On a normal night, the drive takes a few hours. On the night of the 5th and 6th of June, the interior of the Cotentin was full of scattered American paratroopers, most of whom had no idea where they were, but all of whom were armed and trained to react to a vehicle moving on a dark road. Falley's staff car was shot up on the road outside the rear wall of his own headquarters. His aide-de-camp was killed alongside him. A corporal was wounded. The general who had been specifically positioned to defeat the Allied airborne assault on the Cotentin was killed by paratroopers he encountered by accident, 300 meters from his own front door, before he had issued a single operational order in response to the invasion. The 91st Air Landing Division then spent the critical first hours of D-Day without a commanding general, without a coherent picture of the tactical situation, and without the ability to concentrate its forces against the scattered but advancing American paratroopers who were, in groups of 2 and 5 and 12 men, moving toward objectives that a full-strength division could have denied them. Von der Heydt's 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment was a different kind of German unit, and the contrast with the 91st Division's paralysis is instructive. The regiment had been in the Cotentin area since April of 1944. Von der Heydt was an experienced combat commander with a background in military law and a professional's instinct for flexible defense. When the Allied airborne drops began, the 6th Fallschirmjäger did not freeze. It responded within its command capacity, dispersed, maintained unit cohesion through the night, and prepared defensive positions at Cotentin, with the specific intention of contesting the town, at operational cost to the attackers, rather than defending it to literal destruction. Von der Heydt understood, and this is visible in the tactical dispositions his regiment took up on June 6th and 7th, that his job wasn't to stop the 101st Airborne entirely. It was to make their advance south toward Cotentin expensive enough to delay the junction of the two American beachheads. He nearly succeeded. The 6 days it took the 101st to take Cotentin, measured against the 1 day the original plan had allocated for it, is a measure of how effectively one German regimental commander, with a mobile defensive doctrine and a first-rate regiment, compensated for the failure of the divisional command structure around him. Here's where I find the German perspective most revealing. when I put the 7th Army telephone log against the Allied operational records side by side. The scatter that is described in American accounts as a navigational disaster, which it was, looks, from the German side of the same records, like an information attack of remarkable effectiveness. The German command apparatus at every level, from regimental to army, spent the critical first hours of D-Day trying to determine where the American main effort was directed, and the scatter prevented them from reaching any conclusion. This wasn't planned, it was accidental, but the effect was identical to what a deliberate deception operation would have tried to achieve. Maximum uncertainty in the enemy's command cycle at the moment when the landing was most vulnerable. The Albany operation achieved its most important strategic effect, delaying an effective German response, through its most prominent operational failure. That's not a clean success story. It's a much stranger thing, a mistake that worked. The Hitler Reserve release problem deserves its own moment in this chapter, because it sits at the intersection of the tactical German response and the strategic German command culture that made Overlord possible. The armored reserve formations that could have driven to the Normandy coast on D-Day morning and potentially rolled up the Utah beachhead were held under Hitler's personal release authority, OKW Reserve. They could not be committed without the Führer's specific authorization. On the morning of the 6th of June, Hitler was asleep. His staff debated waking him. They did not wake him immediately. By the time the release was authorized, hours had passed. The moment for a decisive armored counterattack against the beachhead, before it had consolidated depth and anti-tank capability, was closing. The airborne drops had contributed to this delay by creating the informational chaos that prevented German commanders from presenting a clear, decisive picture to the high command. And without a clear, decisive picture, Hitler's staff wouldn't wake him for what might turn out to be a feint. The scatter bought time. The time bought the beach. The 7th Army's post-war assessment of the D-Day airborne operations, produced in the Prisoner of War Interrogation Program and incorporated into American operational analyses, is an interesting document to read against the official German unit histories, because they don't quite agree on the degree of failure the command structure experienced. The official German regimental and divisional histories, produced in the immediate post-war period, with institutional survival and reputation management as implicit objectives, described the events of June 6th as an organized defensive response to superior Allied forces. The interrogation reports describe something closer to controlled chaos. Commanders who couldn't locate their own units, reserve formations that received contradictory orders, and the specific organizational deficit of a division whose commanding general had been dead for several hours before anyone in the chain of command fully processed what his absence meant for operational capability. The distance between those two descriptions, organized resistance versus controlled chaos, is the distance between what the German military wanted its Normandy performance to look like in retrospect and what it actually looked like in the dark. Major Friedrich von der Heydt survived the Normandy campaign. He survived the war. He was later captured in December of 1944, leading Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 in a night parachute drop during the Battle of the Bulge, Operation Stosser, that scattered his men across a wide area of the Ardennes in darkness, with poor navigation, into terrain they didn't know, against an enemy that was awake and expecting them. Von der Heydt, who had defended Carentan so skillfully against a scattered Allied airborne assault in June, experienced in December a scattered German airborne operation that failed for reasons almost identical to Albany's. He was captured on the 21st of December, 1944. The symmetry is not accidental. Night airborne drops and adverse conditions produce predictable results, regardless of which army is doing the dropping. Von der Heydt knew this. He dropped anyway. The night doesn't negotiate. Chapter 15. The Letters They Wrote Before They Jumped. The 4th of June, 1944. Somewhere in a tent line at one of the staging airfields in southern England, a paratrooper of the 101st Airborne Division sat down with a pencil and a piece of Army-issue writing paper and wrote a letter to his mother. The letter, which survived the war and came to rest eventually in a private family archive, doesn't describe the upcoming operation. It couldn't. Military censorship would have cut any such reference out with scissors before it reached the mail, and the physical evidence of those cuts is visible in hundreds of surviving letters from the period. Rectangular gaps in the page where a censor's blade removed words that seemed to say too much. What this letter describes, in 3 close-written paragraphs, is the weather. Overcast, cool for June, a film the writer had seen 2 nights earlier in a nearby town, and a meal that had been unusually good by Army standards. In the third paragraph, there is a single sentence that has no equivalent in the first 2. I have sealed another envelope addressed to you, which I have asked my tentmate to post if I do not return. I hope you will not receive it. That's the whole of it. The letter about the other letter. Filed at both ends with ordinary life, because the ordinary life is what's real, and the sealed envelope in his kit is what's possible. The Cornelius Ryan Research Archive at Ohio University contains 2,551 questionnaire responses, 955 interviews, and hundreds of letters, diaries, and written accounts from D-Day veterans. Ryan spent nearly a decade collecting these materials for The Longest Day, published in 1959. Among the 101st Airborne responses, a specific pattern appears when you read enough of them in sequence. The men who wrote honestly about the days before D-Day tend to describe 2 things simultaneously, and the 2 things coexist without apparent tension. They were ready. They were afraid. Not ready instead of afraid, or afraid despite being ready. Both at the same time, in the same person, on the same day. The institutional narrative of the 101st emphasizes the readiness and tends to treat the fear as a footnote. The letters reverse that ratio. There is a specific archival phenomenon in the pre-D-Day correspondence that I find almost impossible to read without sitting with it longer than feels comfortable as a researcher. Among the letters and accounts in the Ryan collection, and in smaller private family archives, there are cases where a paratrooper wrote a sealed emergency letter, went into Normandy, survived, came home, and the emergency letter was sent anyway, by a confused tentmate who heard the wrong news, by a supply sergeant who was working from an outdated casualty list, by any number of the administrative mechanisms that 1944 did not have fully robust procedures to prevent. A man arrives back in England from the Cotentin after a week of fighting, reports to his unit, and finds that his family has received the letter he wrote for them to receive, only if he died. The letter is already there, already read, already grieved over. He is alive. He has to write another letter explaining this, to a family that has already experienced his death once on paper. The Ryan archive has accounts of this. It happened. The military paperwork moved faster than the survivor. The letters that discuss practical matters, insurance, personal possessions, what should be done with specific items, are, in a strange way, the most affecting category in the collection. There is a letter in which a man explains, in careful detail, where his wristwatch is kept and who he would like to have it. There is one that specifies what should be done with a hunting rifle left in the care of a neighbor. These letters were written by men who were doing what human beings do when they face the possibility that they won't be there to handle things themselves. They handle things on paper, in advance, with the same methodical attention they brought to packing their equipment. The practicality isn't an absence of feeling. It is feeling, organized. It is love, expressed through logistics, which is perhaps the most military form that love can take. What the censorship system inadvertently preserved, when it cut operational information from the letters, is the emotional register that official documents never record. A letter from which the location and the unit and the date of the operation have been removed is left with what remains: the writer's voice, his relationships, his specific fears and specific hojes, stripped of context but preserved in their essentials. Some of the men who wrote these letters were 20 years old. Some were younger. Most had never been outside their home states before the Army took them. The gap between the Norman countryside they'd studied on sand tables and briefing maps, the bocage, the causeways, the flooded marshes, and the actual landscape that would receive them was not a gap any letter could bridge. They were writing from England about France. The France they were imagining was not the France they were going to get. I keep coming back, in this research, to the letters written to children. Several men in the Ryan collection and in related family archives left letters addressed to children they hadn't yet met. Wives who were pregnant when the men shipped out. Children who existed in their father's correspondence only as future persons, anticipated but unrealized. These letters are addressed by name, to children who don't yet know how to read. The formality of addressing a child directly, "Dear Thomas," "Dear Margaret," in a letter that may never be read aloud to them by a living voice, is among the stranger acts of ordinary love that the archive contains. The father is writing to a future that may not include him. The child is being addressed as if already present, already capable of understanding, already someone who deserves to know that they were thought of, specifically, by name, in a tent in England on the 4th of June, 1944. The military postal censorship system that governed correspondence from the European theater specified what could not be included: operational details, unit designations, troop movements, locations, but explicitly did not restrict emotional content, personal sentiment, or expressions of fear. Censors were instructed to preserve the human voice in the letters they reviewed, cutting only the operationally sensitive material. What this created, in the surviving record, is a documentary form unlike any other. Letters from which the facts have been surgically removed, and only the feelings remain. The rectangle of white space where the censor's scissors passed is itself a kind of historical record. It marks the place where a man tried to say something specific about where he was and what he was about to do, and was prevented from saying it. The feeling around the gap is intact. The gap itself is the operation. Some of the men who wrote sealed emergency letters before D-Day were not killed in Normandy. They came through, went to Market Garden in September, wrote another sealed letter. They came through that too, went to Bastogne in December, wrote another one. Some family archives contain 2 or 3 sealed emergency letters from the same man: the Normandy one, the Market Garden one, the Bastogne one, opened after his death in a later action, or opened after his death decades later from natural causes, all of them received by families who had not known they existed. The accumulation of sealed envelopes across a war is its own form of documentation. It shows you, more precisely than any operational history can, what sustained combat asks of a man who keeps surviving. Not just his body, not just his nerve, but the repeated act of writing down the things he might not have a chance to say, folding them carefully, handing them to someone he trusts, and then going anyway. The Ryan collection holds 2,551 questionnaire responses. In each one, there is a person, not a casualty statistic, not a unit designation, not a rank in an order of battle. A person who sat somewhere in England in the first days of June, 1944, and wrote down what they wanted someone to know, in case. Most of those letters were never sent. The men came back, eventually, in one form or another. The letters they wrote in anticipation of not coming back are still in the archive, not because they were needed for their stated purpose, but because the archive preserved everything, and the everything includes the letters that arrived at families where the writer was already home. The 101st Airborne Division's D-Day story is, among other things, a story about 6,928 people who wrote letters before the operation and boarded their chalk-numbered aircraft anyway. Most of them survived. Some of them didn't. The ones who didn't had, in many cases, written something down. It's in there, filed, archived, available to anyone who asks the university library to pull the box. Chapter 16. Was the night drop a mistake? The historians argue. There's a copy of the USAF Official History of European Theater Airborne Operations, John C. Warren's monograph, published in 1956, in the reference collection at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. It's a working copy, not a display item, and it shows the kind of use that working copies accumulate over decades. At one point in Warren's text, where he writes that the night drop was broadly successful in its strategic objectives, there is a marginal annotation in pencil, unknown hand, unknown date, that asks, in 4 words, "Successful, at what cost?" The question isn't answered in the margin. It isn't answered in Warren's text. It sits there, in pencil, as an unresolved objection to the institutional verdict. This chapter is that pencil note, given the time it deserves. The debate about whether the 101st Airborne's night drop into Normandy was a sound military decision has been running since before the guns stopped. It isn't a peripheral academic argument. It goes to the center of how we evaluate military operations, what metrics we choose, what counterfactuals we permit, what we mean when we say something worked. 3 main positions have accumulated over the 80 years since D-Day, and they are worth presenting as distinct arguments rather than blending them into a false consensus, because the distinctness is the point. They don't agree. They can't be made to agree without suppressing evidence from at least one of them. The first position, call it the outcome argument, is the one that most popular D-Day histories implicitly adopt. It goes like this: The 101st's primary D-Day objectives were substantially achieved. The Utah beach causeways were secured. The La Barquette lock was taken. German command was disrupted at a critical moment. The 4th Infantry Division's landing at Utah Beach was the least costly of the 5 Allied beach landings on D-Day. Therefore, the airborne operation that covered Utah's flank was operationally justified, and whatever its navigational difficulties, it worked. This argument is not wrong. The objectives were achieved. Utah Beach was the least costly D-Day landing. The causal connection between the airborne operation and that outcome is real. The argument's limitation is that it proves the operation achieved its goals, while saying nothing about whether a different approach could have achieved the same goals at lower cost. The second position, call it the methodology argument, comes primarily from the USAF's own official history and from the technical operational analysis documents produced within months of D-Day. It argues that the night drop was proven operationally unsound by the comparison between its own results and the daytime operations that followed it. The same troop carrier groups that scattered the 101st and 82nd in the dark flew with precision and success under heavy fire in the daylight glider and resupply missions on D-Day afternoon and the following days. The correlation between night and scatter, day and accuracy is documented in the same records that describe the drop's tactical success. After Normandy, all 3 subsequent major Allied airborne operations, Dragoon in August of 44, Market Garden in September, and Varsity in March of 45, were conducted in daylight. No announcement was made, no doctrine was published. The practice simply changed. When the people who actually flew the missions subsequently refused to repeat the specific thing that had gone wrong, that constitutes a professional judgment. It just wasn't labeled as one. The third position, call it the necessity argument, was articulated most clearly by Taylor himself in his post-war accounts, and it's the one I find most honest about the actual decision environment. It goes like this. There was no viable alternative. A daylight parachute drop on the Cotentin would have exposed the troop carrier formations to the full weight of German anti-aircraft defenses in clear visibility for an extended approach. The dispersed condition of the Albany force, bad as it was, may have been less bad than the concentrated casualties a daylight approach would have produced. And the strategic requirement, securing the Utah Beach causeways before the 4th Infantry Division hit the beach at H hour, couldn't be accomplished by any other means in the available time. The night drop was not chosen because it was safe. It was chosen because nothing else was available that was safer. This argument is intellectually honest, in a way the other two are not quite. It acknowledges the risk without pretending the risk didn't materialize, and it refuses to vindicate the decision simply because the outcome was acceptable. It says, essentially, we knew this would be expensive. We did it anyway. It was expensive. We got what we needed. That's the whole story. What none of these positions adequately addresses is the training failure that preceded the operation. The exercise Eagle training data had shown, in April of 1944, that the 101st's troop carriers scattered badly in poor visibility. That data existed before D-Day. The proficiency ratings that declared the weak sister groups fully qualified after simulated drops in clear weather were produced by inspectors who explicitly noted the clear weather caveat and then issued the ratings anyway. If the methodology argument against the night drop is correct, that it was proven unsound, then the training record suggests it was knowable as unsound before it was attempted. Not predictable with certainty, but knowable as a substantial risk with documented precedent. The question of why that knowledge didn't produce a mitigation, a modification to the drop altitude requirement, a different routing that avoided the western Cotentin cloud band, a reduced speed protocol enforced by aircraft governors rather than pilot instruction, is not answered by any of the 3 positions. It remains open. To me, the most revealing single document in the entire post-operation assessment is not a casualty table or a drop pattern map. It's a line in the USAF official history where Warren notes, without elaborating, that a night parachute drop was not again used in 3 subsequent large-scale airborne operations. Warren states this as a fact, not as a conclusion. He doesn't say the night drop was wrong. He doesn't say the lesson was learned. He says the practice was discontinued and moves on. That reticence, that careful refusal to draw the inference from the data he has just presented, is the institutional culture of the post-war American military managing its relationship with an operation it had already publicly celebrated as a success. You can't say the operation was both a success and a lesson in what not to do. So Warren says it was a success, and lets the behavioral data make the other argument without saying so. The pencil note in the Eisenhower Library margin is asking the question Warren's text won't. 4,670. That is the 101st Airborne's Normandy campaign casualty figure through June 30th. 546 killed. Those killed cannot be reached by any argument about strategic necessity or operational success. They are simply the cost, fixed in the record, preceding all subsequent debate. The debate about whether the night drop was a mistake will continue as long as people study the Normandy campaign, because it is one of those historical questions, like the Somme, like Gallipoli, that doesn't resolve into a clean verdict without suppressing something important. I don't think it was a simple mistake. I don't think it was a simple success. I think it was a plan that contained a known, documented, accepted risk, the night navigation requirement, that materialized in precisely the way the training data suggested it might, and that the men who survived the risk's materialization then performed well enough to convert a tactical disaster into a strategic asset. That is both true and terrible. It doesn't require anyone to have been stupid or careless. It just requires that the distance between planning and outcome be acknowledged with something more than celebration. Chapter 17. What they left in the ground. Memory, archaeology, and the 80-year reckoning. The spring of 2024. A team of 25 personnel from the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency, the DPAA, traveled to the Manche department of Normandy, France, and began a recovery mission in the fields and waterways of the Cotentin Peninsula. They were looking for men. Specifically, they were looking for American servicemen, some of them from the airborne drops of June 6, 1944, whose remains had never been recovered, identified, and returned to their families. The DPAA conducted this mission 80 years after the events described in this series. They are still looking. The work is ongoing. As of 2024, thousands of American service personnel from World War II remain unaccounted for in the European theater, and the Cotentin Peninsula, those same flooded fields, those same hedgerows, those same ditches where paratroopers in the dark found each other by brass cricket click, still holds some of them. Not metaphorically, physically, in the ground. The Norman landscape has been returning objects from 1944 for 8 decades, intermittently, with the patience of disturbed soil. Farming families in the Cotentin have been finding things since the summer of 1944 ended, and the armies moved on. Equipment containers, ammunition, personal effects, and sometimes human remains. The objects surfaced during plowing, during drainage work, during the installation of modern agricultural infrastructure. A canteen, a fragment of a T5 harness buckle, a Thompson submachine gun magazine, turned up by a plow blade, handed to the local gendarmerie, eventually making its way to one of the regional war museums or private collections that the Cotentin has accumulated in the past 80 years. These are not dramatic discoveries. They are the routine archaeology of an agricultural landscape that was briefly a battlefield and never quite shed the evidence of what happened on it. The Acme clicker, the brass cricket that identified friend from enemy in the Norman dark, was manufactured in Birmingham, England, by the Joseph Hudson Company, trading as Acme whistles. 7,000 of them were produced, on a secret contract, in the 6 months before D-Day. The production run represented the entire identification apparatus for the largest airborne operation in history. 7,000 stamped brass pieces, each about the size of a large thumbnail, each capable of producing its 2-click challenge and countersign, each issued to one paratrooper of the 101st Airborne Division before he boarded his aircraft. The Acme factory in Birmingham was given the contract as a top-secret order. The workers who produced the crickets were not told what they were for. After the operation, Acme retained no examples for its own records. The factory moved on to other contracts. By the late 20th century, genuine, original Acme D-Day clickers had become exceptionally rare. So rare that Acme Whistles launched a public appeal in 2019 to locate surviving examples for the 75th anniversary of D-Day. They found one, in a family collection, a stone's throw from their own factory. 7,000 made. One confirmed original in the archive 75 years later. The other 6,999 are scattered across the world, in private collections, in Norman fields, at the bottom of Norman water features, and in the pockets of men who never came home from the Cotentin. The La Barquette lock, which Colonel Johnson captured with 150 improvised strangers at 0400 hours on the 6th of June, 1944. The lock through whose sluice gates Rommel had flooded the Douve Valley. The lock whose capture was supposed to control the water table of the 101st drop zone. The lock that was simultaneously a drowning mechanism and a D-Day objective. That lock still exists. It still functions. It is part of the active water management infrastructure of the lower Douve Valley, used by Norman farmers and the Regional Water Authority to regulate the flow of the river. Local farmers who use the lock are aware, to varying degrees, of its history. Some can tell you exactly what happened there on the 6th of June, 1944. Some use it the way people use functional infrastructure, without ceremony, without particular awareness of what it meant once, because it means something different now, and the present has its own demands. Both relationships with the place are legitimate. The lock doesn't care which one you bring to it. The DPAA's recovery methodology in Normandy, and this is a detail that connects the 80-year-old operation to the current state of forensic science in ways worth dwelling on, uses a combination of ground-penetrating radar survey, magnetometry, and targeted archaeological excavation to identify subsurface anomalies consistent with human remains and associated equipment. The flooded fields of the Douve Valley present specific archaeological challenges. The post-war silt deposits laid down by annual flooding have buried the 1944 surface under successive layers of fine alluvial material. In some areas, the D-Day level ground surface is 30 to 40 centimeters below the current agricultural surface. Ground-penetrating radar at those depths can detect large metal objects with reasonable reliability. It can detect human remains at the margins of its effective resolution, depending on soil chemistry and the degree of skeletal preservation. The DPAA's forensic anthropologists and archaeologists work with the practical knowledge that the tools they're using are better than anything available even 20 years ago, and still not quite good enough for everything the ground holds. The recovery work continues because the technology is improving, and because the obligation doesn't diminish simply because it's difficult. The physical evidence that the night drop happened doesn't only live in the soil. It lives in the regimental museums and the local Normandy history societies, in the attic collections of Norman families whose grandparents found things in the years after the war, and in the auction records of military memorabilia markets, where D-Day equipment periodically surfaces and is sold to collectors who may or may not understand the documentary chain of custody they're participating in. In 2018, a D-Day cricket, one of the 7,000 Acme clickers, was sold at a military memorabilia auction in London. Its provenance was documented to a specific unit of the 101st. Its physical condition showed normal wear, consistent with having been carried, used, and kept, rather than lost in a field. The price it achieved was approximately 2,800 British pounds. 7,000 were made. This one had survived in documented private hands. The ones in the Norman fields cost nothing and are worth more, in the specific sense that they are physical evidence at an active archaeological site where men are still being looked for. I've been sitting with this final chapter's question for longer than any other in this series, and I want to say directly what I think it is. It isn't really about memory or about archaeology or about the DPAA's recovery statistics. Those are the vessel. The question is about obligation, specifically about what a nation owes to the men it sent to war, and whose remains it hasn't yet returned to their families. The DPAA estimates that roughly 72,000 American military personnel from World War II remain unaccounted for globally. Of those, a significant number are in the European theater. Of those, some are in the Cotentin, some are in the fields that Rommel flooded, some are in the hedgerows where men assembled in the dark by cricket click and kept moving. They are there. The technology to find them is improving. The DNA programs that allow identification through family reference samples are better in 2026 than they were in 2016, and better than they were in 2006. The accounting isn't finished. It won't be finished in the lifetimes of the grandchildren of the men who jumped. What strikes me, reading the DPAA's recovery reports, alongside the pre-mission planning documents I started this series with, is the persistence of the administrative thread. The chalk numbers, chalked on aircraft fuselages in England on the 5th of June, 1944, to ensure paratroopers boarded the right aircraft. Those chalk numbers survive in the manifests at the National Archives. The manifests connect chalk numbers to names. The names connect to unit rosters. The unit rosters connect to casualty records. The casualty records, where they record the missing, connect to the DPAA's open case files. When DPAA forensic archaeologists recover equipment or remains from a Normandy field and attempt identification, the chain of paper they use to work backward from artifact to person runs through the chalk number system, through the manifest records, through 80 years of archival organization, back to the man who stood in line in England with a numbered placard around his neck, while Eisenhower walked through the crowd and said something nobody recorded. That chain of paper is the series' final primary source. It's still in use. The Norman countryside in late spring looks, at a certain distance, much as it must have looked in June of 1944, the bocage thick and green, the flat coastal fields stretching toward a gray horizon, the Douve Valley low and water-edged in its ancient channel. The differences are visible only when you look closely. The asparagus poles are gone. The sluice gates at La Barquette have been repaired and standardized and fitted with modern control mechanisms. The drop zones Alpha, Charlie, and Delta are now farmland, unmarked as such, returning grain and livestock as they returned generations of Norman farmers before the armies came through. The memorials are on the roadsides and in the church squares. Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, Sainte-Mère-Église, Cotentin, the cemetery at La Combe, the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer above Omaha. The ground holds what the ground holds. The DPAA team will be back. They find a few names a year. The work is slow and the list is long. And somewhere in a DPAA case file database in Hawaii, there are men from the 101st Airborne Division who jumped from chalk-numbered aircraft on the night of the 5th of June, 1944, and whose families haven't heard anything definitive since the telegram arrived. The telegram said missing. The case file says open. 7,000 brass clickers. 432 aircraft. 6,928 men. One night. A cloud bank nobody forecast. A general killed on a dark road by accident. A cricket in a ditch with German voices 40 yards away. A sergeant from West Virginia who cleared 11 farm buildings alone and wasn't given the medal. A division commander crouching in a hedgerow with 13 men and no radio contact. 4,670 casualties. One lock still turning water. The 80 years haven't closed anything. They've just made it quieter. The ground keeps the rest.